The land did not forgive mistakes. Under a pitiless Wyoming sun, a woman in ruined gray silk ran across endless gold country. Wrong, desperate, beyond ordinary fear. Behind her dust rose in a deliberate column 3 horses, driven hard and mean. She fell hard in the dry grass, forced herself up, kept running. A quarter-mile away, a man mending a rail fence straightened, shaded his eyes with a raw hand. His hand found the revolver before thought caught up. Something with a rifle scope woke behind his eyes. Something that had never truly slept. The dust drew closer. Hooves drummed beneath the wind. She reached the lone cottonwood and collapsed into its shadow, gasping. He offered the canteen instead of his hand. Drink slow. The riders were a minute out. He walked to the porch steps, laid the Winchester across his knees, and waited. Wyoming Territory, 1882. The land did not forgive mistakes. Silas Wexford had learned that a long time ago, in a different country of grass and smoke, though the lesson had followed him west and settled into the dirt here just the same. Out here, a man's whole life could hang on a fence post set an inch too shallow, on a well dug in the wrong spot, on a single winter he wasn't ready for. The land did not care what a man intended. It only cared what he did. He was 38 years old, and he had a rail fence half mended, and a son that would not quit. Sweat ran down his spine in one long, thin line. He did not wipe it away. There was a rhythm to this work, and he had learned to trust the rhythm, the way other men trusted scriptures. Swing the hammer, set the nail, breathe, swing again. Because if he kept that rhythm, if he never let it break his mind, stayed quiet. That was the whole trick of it. Keep the hands moving. Keep the hands busy. Because the second his hands went still, something else woke up behind on his eyes. Something with a rifle scope in it. Something with a field of tall grass and a boy 19, maybe 20, wearing the wrong color coat who never once saw him coming. He set the hammer down, not because his arm was tired, because his hand had started to shake, just slightly, and he did not want to stand here in the heat and watch that happen to himself again. 5 years he'd had this land. 5 years of frost that split his knuckles and sun that browned his neck to leather, and his own 2 hands turning raw, ungrateful dirt into something that looked, from a distance, almost like a life. A cabin, low and sturdy, chinked tight against the wind. A corral he'd built board by board, a well, 20 feet down through hard rock, that had taken him the better part of a summer, and had nearly broken something in his back that never quite healed right. He called the place Whisper Creek, after the thin ribbon of water that ran along its northern edge. Not much of a creek, if he was honest. Barely a whisper at all, most months. But it was his, or it would be. Once enough seasons passed that the paper sitting in a government office 100 miles away turned from a claim into a deed nobody could question. He was alone out here. That had been the whole point of it. A man who lives alone does not have to explain himself, does not have to answer for the things he did in a war that ended 17 years ago, and had somehow, despite that, never actually ended at all. Not for him. Not really. Out here there was no one to ask why he flinched at the crack of a dry branch underfoot. No one to notice how some nights he sat up long after the lamp burned low, his revolver resting in his lap not because he expected trouble, but because the weight of it in his hands was the only thing that kept those hands from shaking on their own. Before the war, he had been a different kind of man entirely. A farm boy out of the Ohio bottomlands, the kind who worried about weevils in the corn and whether the roof would hold through spring rain. That man had a mother who packed him a Bible and a tin of hard candy the morning he left for the recruiting station, certain, the way young men are always certain, that he would be home again by autumn. That man had not come home by autumn. That man, in fact, had never really come home at all. Only a version of him had returned quieter, harder, carrying something behind his eyes. His mother took one look at and never asked about again. He had buried her 2 winters later, sold the farm not long after that. And then there had been years of drifting, work here and there, nothing that asked too much of him or stayed too close, until Wyoming Territory had offered him the one thing he still wanted from the world: distance. Solitude was armor. He had understood that from the first winter. Twice a year, no more. He rode the 11 miles into the small settlement of Larkspur for supplies he couldn't grow, or build himself flour, nails, a new blade for the plow. He kept those trips short, kept his sentences shorter still. The woman who ran the general store, a widow named Odalie Frame, with sharp eyes and a soft heart she pretended not to have, had long since stopped trying to draw him into conversation beyond what the transaction required, though she always slipped an extra twist of hard candy into his flour sack, the way she might have done for a child, or for a man she suspected didn't get enough sweetness anywhere else in his life. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it either. That was the whole shape of his social world these days. A candy twist he didn't ask for, and a silence neither of them broke. What had taken him longer to understand than the value of solitude was that armor, left on too long, starts to rust into a man's skin. Starts to become something he can't take off even when he wants to. He picked the hammer back up. Swing. Set the nail. Breathe. And that was when he saw her. A flicker of gray, far out across the flat gold country. Moving wrong, not walking wrong. Running wrong. The kind of running that comes from somewhere past ordinary fear. Somewhere the body simply takes over because the mind has stopped being able to make decisions of its own. He straightened, shaded his eyes with one raw hand. A woman. Chinese, he thought, though at this distance he could not have said for certain. Beyond the dark hair torn loose from its pins, and whipping behind her like it, too, was trying to escape. Her dress gray silk, or what had once been silk before dust and desperation ruined. It caught the afternoon light in odd, delicate flashes. Wrong color for this land. Too fine. Too soft. Like some piece of another world entirely had been dropped here by mistake, and hadn't yet realized it didn't belong. She was maybe a quarter-mile out. His hand found the grip of his revolver before his mind had finished catching up to the motion. Old habit. Older than the war, maybe. Or born straight out of it. Some days he honestly couldn't say anymore where his instincts ended, and the man he used to be began. Some days those two men felt like the same man entirely, wearing different coats. And then he saw the dust rising up behind her. Not her dust. Bigger. A column of it, rolling and climbing. 3 horses pushed hard and mean across open ground. He knew that kind of riding in his bones the way a man knows the particular sound of his own name spoken in anger. That was not men out chasing rabbits who had stumbled onto something else by accident. That was purpose. That was men who fully intended to finish whatever it was they'd started. He could go inside. The thought arrived clean and simple in his mind, gentle in how easy it made itself sound. Go inside. Bar the door. Let whatever this was pass by his land the way weather passes loud, frightening, and none of his business. He had done exactly that before, more than once. In 5 years of watching trouble drift near Whisper Creek, chasing someone who wasn't him. The territory rewarded a man who understood how to make himself invisible. He had built his whole new life on being invisible. Except she fell. He watched her go down hard in the dry grass, watched the gray dress vanish for one long, terrible second, and then reappear as she forced herself back up onto her feet, slower this time. Slower, but she got up anyway. She kept running. And something about that undid him completely, in a way he did not have time to examine, and would spend a long while afterward trying to understand, because it wasn't only fear driving her forward anymore. There was something else in it, something with a spine. He had spent 17 years running from the memory of people who never got the chance to rise back up. And here, right here, on his own land, under his own, indifferent side, which was someone who refused to stay down. He set the hammer against the fence post. He did not remember deciding to move. He only found himself walking, and then striding, and then nearly running himself, toward the lone cottonwood tree that stood between the cabin and the open country, the only real shade for a mile in any direction. By the time he reached it, she had very nearly reached it too, and she collapsed into its shadow, like the tree itself had physically caught her, gasping, her whole body heaving, with the effort of pulling air into lungs that had long since stopped cooperating. He did not offer his hand. He offered his canteen instead. "Drink slow," he said. His own voice came out rougher than he meant it to. It always did these days. Disuse did that to a man. Turned his own voice into something he had to relearn, using every single time some circumstance forced him to use it. She looked up at him. For one long moment neither of them said a word, because there was nothing that could have mattered more, right then, than the plain fact of two strangers looking at each other across the small distance of a canteen on a strip of prairie that belonged to neither of their old lives, and never would. Her eyes were black, deep, and underneath the terror sitting in them there was something colder, something almost calm, the particular look of a person who has already done the arithmetic of her own death and is simply waiting now to see which number comes up first. She took the canteen. Her hand shook so badly the water nearly spilled, but she drank slow, exactly as he'd told her, with a discipline that surprised him more than the running had. "They will be here in a minute," he said. "Not a question." She nodded. Her eyes went past him, toward the dust cloud, close enough now that he could hear the drum of hooves underneath the wind. "They want something I have," she said. 4 words. That was all. But something in the way she said told him this was not a simple thing. Not a runaway bride. Not a lover's quarrel the territory liked to gossip over for a season and then forget. This was a woman who understood, with total clarity, exactly what was coming for her and exactly why. "Get in the cabin," he said. "Stay away from the window." She hesitated. 1 second. Maybe 2. Long enough that he wondered whether she trusted him at all, or whether she simply had no other choice left in the whole world to make. Then she was up, moving fast despite everything her body had already been through, disappearing through the dark doorway of the clapboard cabin he had built log by log, board by board, across 5 long winters of solitude. He turned to face the riders. He did not hurry. That mattered. He had learned it a long time ago. In a country made of grass and fear, the moment men saw you hurry, you had already told them exactly how frightened you were. So he walked to his porch steps at the same pace he walked everywhere, and he sat down, and he laid his Winchester rifle across his knees, and he waited. He did not lever around into the chamber. The threat of it sat louder in the silence than the action itself ever could have. The 3 riders pulled up 20 yards out, their horses lathered white at the neck and blowing hard from the run. The man in the lead sat his saddle like a man who did not particularly enjoy horses, like he would rather have arrived by private railcar and simply stepped down onto a platform someone else had already swept clean for him. He wore a duster too fine for the trail, unmarked by dust in a way that told Silas plainly this man rarely did his own riding, rarely did his own anything. He had the soft hands of a man who paid other men to hurt other men on his behalf. "Morning," the man said and smiled. It did not reach anywhere near his eyes. Silas said nothing. "We seem to have lost something," the man went on, in the tone of a man discussing a misplaced hat rather than a human being. "A girl, Chinese, wandered off from the railroad camp." His gaze flicked toward the cabin door. "Quick, testing, and then back. We're only looking to escort her home. Company property, you understand. Don't see a company brand on this land," Silas said. His voice stayed flat, flat like a closed door. "This is a private claim, filed and registered in Cheyenne." He let the word sit there in the heat between them, because that was the whole trick of dealing with men like this one. You reminded them quietly, without raising your voice, that laws still existed in places they preferred to believe otherwise. The man's smile tightened. "I'm Desmond Vane," he said, "foreman for the Continental Crescent Railway. We have a schedule to keep, Mr. Wexford." "Mr. Wexford." Vane said the name slowly, like a man filing something away for later, more careful use. "That girl is bonded labor. She broke her contract, company property, as I said. Looked more like she was running for her life," Silas said. "Appearances," Vane said smoothly, "can be deceiving." Behind him, one of the 2 riders younger, sun-scorched, carrying the particular emptiness of a man who had stopped asking questions about his own work a long time ago, shifted his weight in the saddle. Silas noted him and filed him away the same way Vane had filed away his own name. A man like that could turn dangerous fast, and often didn't know it about himself until the moment had already arrived. The 3rd rider said nothing at all. He sat his horse a little apart from the other 2, hat brim low, and there was something in his stillness that pulled at Silas's attention in a way he could not immediately name. Something old. Something that itched at the very back of his mind like a name he couldn't quite recall. He would think about that stillness later. He didn't have the time to think about it now. "We don't want any trouble," Vane continued. "We'll take the girl and be on our way. You can go back to whatever it is you do out here." The dismissal in that last sentence was not subtle at all. "You are nothing," it said. "This does not concern you." Silas shifted the rifle, not aiming it, only letting it settle differently in his hands the way a man settles a tool he intends, if pressed, to actually use. "This is my property," he said. "You're trespassing. The girl isn't here." "Now that," Vane said, something colder sliding beneath the pleasant surface of his voice, "is a lie. My man saw her run straight for this shack." He half turned in the saddle. "Didn't you?" "Straight for it, boss," the younger rider said, spitting a stream of tobacco into the dirt between his horse's front feet. "Never saw her come out the other side." "Then we have a contradiction," Vane said, turning back. his eyes narrowing into something considerably sharper than before. And I find, Mr. Wexford, that when a man lies about one small thing, he is usually lying about everything. A pause. Deliberate. Cruel in its patience. Makes me wonder about that deed of yours. Paperwork has a way of getting misplaced out here, especially for men no one would think to go looking for. There it was. Not a threat about the girl anymore, a threat about the land, about 5 years of his life, about a well he'd dug with his own 2 hands, and a fence post he'd been setting an hour ago, back when his life had still felt, for one more hour, like it belonged only to him. Silas kept his face still. Inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked. Small sound. In the tense hush stretched out between them, it landed like a gunshot. All three riders heard it. Vane's ugly smile came back, slow and pleased with itself. Well now, he said, sounds like you've got a mouse in the house. Silas understood the math perfectly well. 3 against 1. Bad odds by any honest count a sober man would make. But he had learned something in the war that had never once left him. No matter how hard he'd tried burying it under 5 winters of hard work, that retreating today was very often only a slower way of dying later. Men like Vane did not stop taking things. They only ever stopped when something else stopped them first. He stood, slow, deliberate, the Winchester loose at his side, muzzle toward the ground, and somehow that stillness carried more weight in it than raising the weapon ever could have. You heard the man, he said. This is my claim. The next rider who crosses past that cottonwood without an invitation is going to learn exactly how seriously I take that. The younger rider's hand drifted toward his hip. Small movement. Barely anything at all. But Silas caught it the way he caught everything these days, too fast, too complete, an old wartime reflex that had never once switched itself off. No matter how many peaceful years he'd tried to bury it under, he did not move the rifle. He only looked at the young man directly, steady, unblinking, and said nothing because sometimes saying nothing was the loudest warning a man could give. The young rider's hand stopped, settled back onto his thigh. Easy, Vane murmured, without turning his head, the word aimed backward like a leash pulled taut. We're only talking. Talk faster then, Silas said. Sun's getting up and I've got fence to mend. Something flickered across Vane's face, not quite anger, not quite respect. Some uncomfortable cousin of both, and beside him, the silent third rider shifted his weight in the saddle, one slow inch, his hand never once straying near his own weapon. Silas noticed that too. Noticed how carefully still the man kept himself, as though stillness were a discipline he'd spent years perfecting. Vane studied him. A long moment. Long enough that Silas could feel the younger rider's nerves fraying somewhere behind Vane's shoulder. Long enough that the third man, still silent, still watching everything with a stillness that crawled straight under Silas's skin, seemed to be recalculating something behind flat, careful eyes. Vane saw a weathered man, sun-worn denim, a face like a road map of wind and hard years. But he also saw the stillness in Silas's hands, the complete absence of fear where fear, by every reasonable measure, should have been sitting. This was not a dirt farmer. Silas watched that particular understanding land somewhere behind Vane's eyes, watched the man's private calculations shift. This isn't over, Vane said, and every last trace of false warmth dropped clean out of his voice. I'll have what's mine. He wheeled his horse. His men followed. They did not gallop away. They rode at a slow, deliberate pace, a pace built entirely to say, we are not afraid. We are only choosing, for now, to leave. And Silas stood on his porch and watched the dust of them shrink into the horizon until it was nothing but a pale smudge against the darkening sky. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The immediate danger had passed. But something colder had already settled into his chest, something he recognized because he had felt it before, in another life, in another country of dust and fear. It was the particular kind of stillness that arrives right before something far worse comes to collect what it's owed. Desmond Vane was not a man who forgot a debt or an insult. His hands did not start shaking until the dust of the riders had disappeared entirely. Silas stood on the porch a moment longer, alone, and let it happen. Let his hands tremble around the stock of the rifle the way they hadn't dared to while Vane could still see him. It was an old, familiar shame, this shaking. It came for him after every confrontation, small or large, the same way it always had the body paying afterward in private, for whatever courage it had been forced to spend in public. He thought, unbidden, of a field in Virginia, tall grass, a gray coat in the distance, moving where it shouldn't have been moving, a silence right before the shot, and a much larger silence after it, the kind of silence that doesn't end. Not really, not even 17 years later. The boy had been a scout, younger than Silas, carrying dispatches, not weapons, though there had been no way to know that from 400 yards, through a rifle scope, in the failing evening light, he had followed his orders. He had never once, in 17 years, managed to forgive himself for following them so well, until his own breathing steadied, until his hands finally stopped their shaking. And so he turned at last and went back inside to face the woman he had just decided, without ever quite deciding, to protect. She was not, in that first hour, the same woman who would sit so calmly at his table and speak of stolen wages with a clerk's cold precision. In that first hour, alone in the dark of his cabin while the confrontation played out beyond the door, Wan Ling was still, underneath everything, a woman replaying the exact moment her whole life had split into before and after. It had happened 3 nights earlier, though it felt, already, like something that had occurred to a different person entirely. The camp had gone quiet past midnight, the way it always did, not a peaceful quiet, never that, but the particular exhausted silence of 200 bodies too worked over to do anything but sleep where they'd fallen. Wan Ling had been at the ledger table in the foreman's shack, copying figures by lamplight, when she heard Mei Fong coughing through the thin plank wall, separating the women's barracks from the office. Coughing, and then not coughing, which was worse. She had gone to her, of course, had knelt in the dark beside the older woman's pallet, and pressed a hand to a forehead burning far too hot, and had understood, in the particular way a person understands a thing they've been avoiding knowing, that Mei Fong would not survive another week of full shifts. Not without rest. Not without proper medicine, the kind that cost real money, the kind the company store sold at 4 times its worth to people who had no choice but to pay it. She had gone to Vane the next morning. That had been her mistake, if it could be called one. She had asked plainly for a week's rest for Mei Fong, and had offered in return to make up the lost labor herself on top of her own duties. A fair trade. An honest one. Vane had laughed. Not cruelly. Exactly. That was the terrible part of it. The part she had turned over and over in her mind every hour since. He had laughed the easy, untroubled laugh of a man for whom her request had never once registered as a request from a person, only as an inconvenience from a piece of equipment that had, unaccountably, started speaking. "You keep good books, Sue," he'd said, not even looking up from his desk. "Don't spoil it by asking me to lose money on a woman who'll likely die anyway." Something in her had gone very still, hearing that. Not broken. Stilled, the way water stills right before it freezes solid. She had gone back to the ledger table that same afternoon, and instead of copying only the false figures Vane wanted recorded, she had begun carefully, secretly, in the smallest hours available to her, copying the true ones as well, into a second book small enough to hide inside her sleeve. She had told no one, not even Mei Fong, because Mei Fong, feverish and afraid, could not have kept such a secret even if she'd wanted to, and a secret like this one could get a person killed for merely knowing it. 3 nights of copying, 3 nights of terror every time a footstep passed too close to the office door. And then on the 4th night, Vane's clerk, a nervous, watery-eyed man named Pruitt, who did whatever Vane told him, without ever once looking directly at the person he was told to do it to, had noticed the second ledger left half open on the table during a moment Wan Ling had stepped away to fetch water. She had known, the instant she came back through the door and saw his face, that everything had changed. She had not waited to find out what Vane intended to do about it. She had taken the finished ledger, tucked deep into her sleeve, and she had walked, not run, not yet. Walking drew far less attention than running straight out through the camp's unguarded eastern edge, past the blasting powder shed, past the rows of barracks where 200 exhausted people slept without any idea their whole fragile world was about to be set alight behind them. She had run properly only once she reached open country, when she heard the first shout go up behind her, and had not stopped running, not really, until a stranger's canteen found its way into her shaking hands beneath a lone cottonwood tree on a claim she had never heard of, belonging to a man whose name she did not yet know. She thought of Mei Fong now, lying in the dark of Silas Wexford's cabin, and felt the old fear rise fresh in her chest all over again, not fear for herself this time, but fear for the woman she had left behind, coughing in the dark, with no one now to slip her the extra ration of rest a second ledger might, eventually, if this stranger's road to Cheyenne held, be able to buy her. That fear, more than any other single thing, was what steadied Wan Ling's spine when Silas finally came back through the cabin door. Because whatever this cost her, whatever it cost him, it could not possibly cost more than staying silent already had. The cabin held its breath the same way the land outside had. He found her sitting very still at his small table, hands folded tight in her lap, spine held straight in a way that looked less like composure and more like the last remaining thing keeping her from coming apart entirely. She had used the basin of water by the door to wash the dust from her face, and in the lantern light her features came clear. For the first time young, he thought, no older than 20, though her face carried a great deal more history in it than her years should have allowed. "You should not have done that," she said. Her English was clean, precise, more careful, if anything, than his own each word set down like a stone she had chosen not to waste. "Done what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Help me." Her dark eyes lifted to his, and there was something almost like accusation in them, as though his kindness had been a debt she'd never wanted placed on her ledger. "You have put yourself in danger. For a stranger you owe nothing. They were on my land," he said, as if that explained the whole of it. To him it did. His land was the one remaining thing in the world he could point to and say, "This, at least, is mine." An attack on it was an attack on the single solid fact left of his entire existence. She studied him a long moment, as though trying to decide whether that was foolishness or something considerably rarer. "Mr. Vane does not care about your land," she said finally. "He cares only for what passes through it, and he believes I belong to him. He called you bonded labor." Something shifted across her face. The fear did not leave it exactly, but it was joined now by something colder, something, Silas understood, that had been simmering in her for a great deal longer than this one afternoon. "He is a thief," she said. "He brought 200 of us across the water, promising fair wages to lay track for his railroad. He pays us a fraction of what was promised. He charges double for food and lodging at the company store, and takes the difference from our wages before we ever see a single coin of it." Her jaw tightened. "We are not laborers, Mr. Wexford. We are prisoners held inside a debt that was never honest to begin with." Silas set down the rag he had been using to clean his rifle. The smell of gun oil hung thick in the small room, mixing with wood smoke and the last dying heat of the day. "You know my name," he said. "I don't know yours." "Su Wan Ling," she said, and then, quieter as though it cost her something to add, "Most men here call me by whatever is easiest for their own tongue. You may call me by mine, if you're willing to learn it properly." "Wan Ling," he repeated, carefully, and something in her carefully held composure eased just slightly at the effort he made to say it right. "My father traded silk," she said, after a while, unprompted, as though the story had been waiting a long time behind her teeth for someone worth telling it to. "A good business, once. Then a bad harvest and a worse partner and a debt that was never truly ours to begin with. A broker came through our province promising 3 years of honest railroad wages in America. Enough to clear everything. Enough to bring my father's name back to respectability." Her hands, still folded, tightened against each other. "My father did not live to see me leave. My brother signed the contract in his place. I have not seen my brother since the docks. In Canton you came alone." "I came with 200 strangers," she said, "which is its own kind of alone." She did not cry telling it. Silas noticed that, noticed the careful, deliberate flatness in her voice, the same flatness he used himself when he talked, which was almost never about the war. He recognized it because he owned the same thing. "The camp," he said. "Tell me." "Barracks, thin walls. Men and women both, worked from before light until well past dark, laying track through country that does not want to be tamed." Her eyes went distant. "There is a woman there. Mei Fong. She keeps the sick ones alive with what little medicine we're allowed. She has a cough of her own now, and no one will spare her a week's rest to heal it, because a week's rest costs the company money it has. Already decided it does not owe us." A pause. "If I do not return, and if this book never reaches anyone who matters, Mei Fong dies in that camp, as do others. Mr. Vane will simply replace us. There is always another ship, always another broker, always another 200 names he can turn into ghosts on a payroll." Silas said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have sounded small, set next to that. She reached then into the sleeve of her torn gray tunic and drew out a small leather-bound book no larger than the palm of his hand. She set it down on the table between them like she was set down something that weighed a great deal more than its size would ever suggest. "This is why he wants me back," she said. "Or wants me dead. Whichever proves less trouble for him in the end." He picked it up, opened it. Columns of careful, precise characters ran beside columns of numbers, all of it recorded in a hand so neat it looked almost printed by machine. "I can't read this," he admitted. "I can," she said. "I kept records from my father before the debts. I learned English and figures from a missionary who passed through our village twice a year. When I arrived at the camp, Mr. Vane discovered I could write a clean hand, and decided a woman who could keep his books quietly was useful to him. He did not think a woman capable of understanding what she copied. That was his mistake, and I have made very good use of it since." She turned the pages, quick and sure, and pointed. "Here, he bills the railway company for 50 kegs of blasting powder. He purchases 20, the rest of the money finds its way into his own pocket. Here he claims wages for 300 men. We are only 200. Every week he steals the wages of 100 men who do not exist at all." She flipped further. Dates, amounts, shipping manifests, all of it laid out with a clerk's cold, unforgiving precision. "It is all here," she said. "Enough, I believe, to send him to a federal prison for the rest of his natural life. He let me see far more than he ever should have. Pride does that to a certain kind of man. It makes him careless in exactly the place he can least afford to be." Silas closed the ledger slowly. A cold, settling understanding moved through his chest. This small book was not merely evidence, it was a death sentence. For Vane, if it ever reached the right hands. For Wan Ling, if it did not. She was not simply a runaway, she was a witness. A prosecutor, holding in her own two hands the single thing capable of unmaking a powerful, dangerous man. And Silas, by stepping between Vane and the one real threat against him, had just painted a target squarely across his own chest, his own land, his own 5 careful years of silence. "He won't ride in here again," Silas said slowly, working it through as the words left him. "Not in daylight. He's smarter than that now." "He will go after your land," Wan Ling said, with a certainty that chilled him more thoroughly than any threat Vane himself had spoken aloud. "He threatened it already, and men like him do not make idle threats. He will travel to the land office in Cheyenne. He will claim you have not met the requirements of the Homestead Act. He will find some witness willing to swear you have not lived here the full 5 years required. He will pay a clerk to misplace the true record." Her eyes held his, steady and grave. "The paper you carry will become worthless, and you will have nothing left standing between yourself and men with guns." She was right, and he knew it settling cold in the pit of his stomach. His entire world, the back-breaking years, the fence posts driven into hard ground, the well he had dug alone through solid rock, rested finally on nothing more than a single sheet of paper sitting 100 miles away in a room he had never even seen. A sheet of paper a man like Vane could make disappear with the simple stroke of a bribed pen. He looked at her, at the quiet, stubborn resolve holding her upright despite absolutely everything stacked against it. He could still send her away, could still saddle up come morning and ride the opposite direction, abandon the whole claim, vanish into the high country the way men who wanted to disappear had always, eventually, done in this territory. Survival, technically, remained an option. But he looked around the small cabin he had built, log by log, with his own 2 hands, the neat stacks of firewood, the swept floor, the small, hard-won proof of a life he had clawed back out of silence and guilt across 5 winters, and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was not going to run. Not this time. This place was not only land. It was the one piece of himself he had managed, after everything the war had taken, to rebuild from nothing. "Cheyenne is 3 days' ride," he said. "There's a federal marshal's office there. This book," he tapped it once, gently, the way a man touches something fragile, "belongs in his. Not Vane's, not anyone else's." Something in Wan Ling's carefully held composure finally broke. A single tear traced a clean, silent line through the last of the dust still clinging to her cheek. "He will kill you on that road," she said. "Maybe," Silas allowed. His voice stayed even, steady. The voice of a man who had already made his peace with several different kinds of dying. A long time ago, in a war neither of them had ever chosen to fight. "But if I stay here, he'll kill me for the land, eventually anyway. At least out there, I'm moving. At least out there, I get to choose which way I fall." 3 miles east, along a rutted trail cutting through low sage, Corwin Reeve rode a length behind Desmond Vane and said nothing at all. He had said nothing the whole way back. That in itself wasn't unusual. Corwin had always been the quiet one, even back in the war, even back when quiet men were the ones other men learned quickly not to trust. But this silence sat differently in him. This silence had teeth in it, because he knew that face. He had told himself, the first half-mile, that he was wrong. Told himself the sun had been in his eyes, that 5 years and a beard and a life of hard weather could remake any man's features enough to fool an old friend at 20 yards. He had wanted badly to be wrong. Except he wasn't, which meant the man sitting calm and armed on that porch, the man who had stood down Desmond Vane without so much as raising his voice, was Silas Wexford. The same Silas Wexford who had once shared a cook fire and a canteen and a long, terrible night in a Virginia wood with Corwin, back when they were both young enough to still believe the war made any kind of sense. The same Silas Wexford who had done the thing neither of them had ever spoken of again. Not once. Not in 17 years. Corwin's hand tightened on his reins, until Vane's voice cut across the quiet, pulling him back. "You're awful quiet, Reeve. Just thinking, boss." "About what?" Corwin looked straight ahead, at the dark shape of the trail unspooling toward the camp. "About how a man that calm with a rifle in his lap," he said carefully, "generally has a reason to be." Vane made a small dismissive sound in his throat. "Some drifter playing hero. We'll see how calm he stays." Corwin said nothing more. Because if he told Vane the truth right now, tonight, the whole shape of what came next would change in ways Corwin wasn't ready to put into motion. Vane would want to use it, would want to press an old war wound like a thumb into a bruise, if it meant getting his ledger back faster. And Corwin did not know, yet, whether he wanted to hand Silas Wexford over to a man like that, which was its own kind of answer if he let himself sit with it too long. So he didn't. He rode on in silence instead, the old memory turning over and over behind his eyes, the wood, the gray light, the single terrible shot that had ended one boy's war and started, quietly, the slow unraveling of two other men's peace. He would decide what to do with what he knew. Just not tonight. Desmond Vane did not sleep either, though for entirely different reasons. He sat alone in the foreman's shack, long after his men had gone to their bunks. A bottle of good whiskey, the kind he never shared, kept locked in a drawer, meant for company ledgers, open on the desk in front of him, and turned the day's failure over and over in his mind, like a man worrying a stone in his pocket. A drifter with a rifle and a claim. That was all Wexford should have been. A minor obstacle, the kind Vane had brushed aside a dozen times before, across a dozen other camps, in a dozen other territories, on his long climb up from a section foreman's assistant to a man who now controlled the wages, the contracts, and the very lives of 200 people who had no one else in this country to appeal to. He had built something here, something real, a tidy, profitable little empire hidden inside the honest books of a legitimate railway, and he had built it patiently, carefully, never taking so much at once that anyone above him would think to look closer. Ghost wages, padded manifests, a woman who could keep 2 sets of figures without anyone the wiser, until, apparently, someone had become the wiser. He poured another 2 fingers of whiskey and drank it without tasting it. The girl's ledger, if it truly existed in the detail he feared it did, was not merely an inconvenience. It was the whole architecture of his last 6 years, laid bare in a hand too neat and too careful for any judge to dismiss as rumor or exaggeration. If it reached Cheyenne, if it reached the wrong federal marshal, the kind who couldn't be bought or frightened off, he would lose everything. Worse than everything. He would lose it publicly, which was its own particular kind of death for a man who had spent his whole life climbing precisely so that no one would ever again look at him the way they'd looked at his father, a failed shopkeeper, buried in debts, buried finally in a pauper's grave nobody but Desmond had bothered to visit. He would not go back to being nobody. He tapped a finger against the desk, turning the problem over with the same cold precision he applied to every ledger he'd ever falsified. The land office angle was already in motion, a letter to a clerk in Cheyenne he'd kept comfortable with small bribes for exactly this kind of contingency, questioning the validity of a certain homestead claim near Whisper Creek. That alone might take weeks to unfold, though. Too slow. If the girl and her new protector meant to ride hard for the marshal's office themselves, which meant the land office was merely his second line of attack, the first would have to be faster and considerably more direct. He thought of Reeve, sitting silent on his horse through the entire confrontation, watching Wexford with an expression Vane hadn't quite been able to read at the time and found, now, turning suspicious in his memory, Reeve had gone quiet on the ride back. Quieter than usual, and Corwin Reeve was already the quietest man on his payroll. Something to watch, perhaps. Later. For tonight, there were faster men to send, and a wire he could arrange to a contact along the Cheyenne Road who owed him considerably more than money. Desmond Vane finished his whiskey, capped the bottle, and locked it back in its drawer beside the ledgers he could not afford to lose. Whatever it cost him, whatever men he had to spend to do it, that book was coming back into his hands. Or it was going into the ground with whoever carried it. The lantern burned low in the cabin at Whisper Creek, and neither of its two occupants slept. Silas lay on the floor near the hearth, his rifle within reach out of pure habit, listening to Wan Ling's careful, measured breathing from the narrow bed he had insisted she take. Somewhere past midnight, he heard her shift, and knew by the particular quality of her stillness afterward that she was awake too, staring up at the same dark ceiling beams he was. "Mr. Wexford," she said very quietly, into the dark. "Silas is fine." A pause. Silas. She'd tried the name the way he had tried hers, careful, testing its shape. "Why did you truly stop today? And do not tell me again about the land. I've watched and protect land before. It does not look like what I saw on your porch." He was quiet a long moment. "There was a boy," he said finally, "in the war. Wearing a coat the wrong color. Same as your dress was the wrong color out there today. I had a clear shot and orders that made it simple, and I took it. And it was only after that I learned he wasn't carrying a rifle at all. Only papers. Dispatches." His voice did not shake exactly, but it thinned, the way a rope thins right before it gives. "I've had 17 years to decide what kind of man does that and lives with it afterward. I still haven't decided. But I know I'm not going to be the kind of man who watches somebody fall in the dirt and does nothing a second time, not while I've got a say in it." Silence then. Long and unhurried. "Thank you," Wan Ling said, "for telling me a truth instead of a comfortable one." Quiet again, for a while. Then unexpectedly, her voice again, lighter this time, almost testing. "Does this mean you intend to keep frowning at me the entire ride to Cheyenne? Or is that expression reserved only for railroad thieves and unwelcome house guests?" Silas huffed something that was almost a laugh. "Didn't realize I was frowning." "You have been frowning since the cottonwood tree," she said. "I assumed it was simply the shape of your face. Then you spoke, and I understood it was a personality. 5 years alone. Does that man's personality? Then it is fortunate," she said, "that you will not be alone for the next 3 days. That's supposed to comfort me." "No," she said. "It is supposed to warn you. I talk a great deal when I am frightened, Mr. Wexford." "Silas, you should prepare yourself accordingly." "I'll manage," he said, and found saying it, that he meant it more than the joke should have allowed. "Get some sleep," he said. "Morning's going to ask a great deal of both of us." She did not answer that. But sometime later, in the deep quiet before dawn, he heard her breathing finally slow into something like real rest, and he lay awake a while longer himself, watching the gray light gather at the edges of the shuttered window, thinking about roads and debts, and the particular arithmetic of choosing at last to stop running. Dawn came up thin and colorless over Whisper Creek, the kind of light that hadn't yet decided what sort of day it meant to be. Silas was already moving before the sun cleared the ridge, saddling his horse, checking the cinch the way he always did, an old habit from a life where a loose strap could cost a man considerably more than his dignity. He packed light, hardtack, dried meat, a spare box of cartridges, the canteen refilled at the well he'd dug with his own hands. The ledger went into an oilskin pouch, wrapped twice, tucked deep inside his saddlebag, where no casual search would find it easily. Wan Ling came out as he was cinching the second horse, an old steady mare he kept for exactly this kind of unexpected necessity. She had changed into a spare shirt and a pair of denim trousers he'd left, folded on a shelf for longer than he cared to admit. The gray silk tunic finally, mercifully, retired to a drawer. She looked, in the thin morning light, like a different woman than the one who had collapsed under his cottonwood tree the day before, not less afraid, just no longer willing to let the fear decide anything for her. "You ride?" he asked. "Badly," she admitted. "But I learn quickly. I have had to my whole life." "We'll fix badly," he said, and something in the way he said it, plain unhurried, no trace of doubt, and it eased something tight behind her ribs. He was checking the second saddle strap when he heard the horse. One horse. Coming slow, deliberate, from the eastern trail, Not the reckless charge of the day before, but something far more careful. Silas's hand found his rifle before conscious thought caught up, and he turned to see a single rider emerge from the low morning mist, hat brim pulled down, hands held loose and visible at his sides. The third man, the silent one from Fane's crew. He reined up 20 feet out and did not dismount. For a long moment, neither man said anything at all, and then the rider lifted his chin just slightly, and the angle of the morning light finally caught his face clean, and Silas felt something cold, an enormous drop through the center of his chest. "Been a long time, Wexford," Corwin Reef said. "Virginia was greener than this." Silas did not lower the rifle. "Corwin, I remember everything about that summer," Silas said, and his voice had gone somewhere flat and far away. "Every hour of it." "You were the one who pulled me off that boy," Silas said, and something in his chest cracked open just slightly, saying it aloud after 17 years of not. After. When I couldn't stop looking at him. "I remember," Corwin said quietly. "I remember you didn't sleep for 4 nights running. I remember thinking, watching you, that the war had found a new way to kill a man without ever needing to fire a second shot at him." "Did it work?" Silas asked. "On you, I mean." Corwin was quiet a long moment, his eyes somewhere far past the horizon. "Some days," he said. "Other days I still don't know which parts of me made it home and which parts stayed in that wood with your boy. Figured working for a man like Desmond Vane was a fair enough punishment for not knowing the difference anymore." His eyes flicked, briefly, to Wanling standing still and wary beside the mare. "Vane doesn't know I recognized you. Not yet. Why tell me instead of him?" Corwin was quiet a moment, his jaw working like the words cost him something physical to produce. "Because I've spent 17 years same as you, I'd wager," he said finally. "Trying to work out what kind of man does the things we did and still gets to call himself decent afterward. I never worked it out either." He glanced at the eastern trail behind him, toward the camp, toward Vane, toward everything waiting back there. "You're riding for Cheyenne." With that, it wasn't a question. Silas said nothing, which was its own answer. "Vane will send more than 3 men next time," Corwin said. "And he won't send them slow." He gathered his reins, preparing to turn his horse back the way he'd come. "I'm not going to stop you today. I don't rightly know yet what I'll do tomorrow. But you should know, Wexford, some debts don't stay quiet forever. Yours or mine." He wheeled his horse and rode back east without waiting for a reply, back toward the rising sun and the camp and the man who paid his wages, leaving Silas standing in the thin morning light with a rifle he hadn't needed to raise, and a past he could no longer pretend was fully buried. Wanling came to stand beside him, watching the rider shrink into the distance. "You know him," she said. "It wasn't a question either." "I did once," Silas said. "I'm not sure what he is to me now. Friend or warning. Might be both at the same time. Men come out of a war carrying stranger things than that." He turned back to the horses, checked the cinch one final time, more out of need for something to do with his hands than any real doubt in the knot. "We should move," he said. "Vane knows which direction we're headed now, whether Corwin tells him plain or not. A man like that doesn't need to be told twice where a threat is riding." Wanling swung up onto the mare with more determination than grace, found her balance, and looked down at him, this stranger who had offered her a canteen instead of a hand, and had somehow, in the space of one long day and one longer night, become the only person left in the territory she trusted completely. "Then let us not give him the chance to catch us standing still," she said. Silas allowed himself, for just a moment, something that was almost a smile. He swung up into his own saddle, turned his horse's head toward the rising sun and the long, hard road to Cheyenne, and did not look back at the cabin, or the well, or the fence he had never finished mending. Some things, once a man decides to defend them, stop needing to be looked at to be remembered. Behind them, Whisper Creek sat quiet in the morning light, the cottonwood shadow stretching long and thin across ground that had, in less than a single day, stopped being merely a claim and become, instead, the first line of a much larger war. They rode the first hour mostly in silence, the mare, finding her stride beside Silas's gelding, the land opening up around them wide and gold and indifferent to anything either of them carried inside their chests. "You sit a horse like you're waiting for it to apologize," Silas said finally, watching her grip the reins too tight, her shoulders hunched forward against a fall that hadn't happened yet. "I have never had reason to trust anything with 4 legs and its own opinions," Wanling said. "Horses don't have opinions." "This one," she said, nodding down at the mare's twitching ears. very much disagrees with you. Despite himself? Something close to a laugh moved through his chest, rusty, unfamiliar, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. He reached over without asking and adjusted her grip on the reins, loosening her fingers, showing her where to let the slack settle. Sit easy, he said. She'll only fight you if you fight her first. That is remarkably good advice, Wanling said, for a man who spent an entire morning glaring down three armed strangers rather than simply asking them to leave. Different kind of horse, Silas said. That, finally, earned something like a smile from her small quick, gone almost before it arrived, but real. They crossed the first dry wash an hour later, the mare balking hard at the loose shale underfoot, and for one heart-stopping moment Wanling pitched sideways in the saddle, a short, sharp sound of alarm escaping her before she caught herself against the pommel. Silas was already there, his hand closing fast around her arm, steadying her before she could go all the way down. I have you, he said. I noticed, she said, breathless, and did not immediately pull her arm free of his grip, and neither of them commented on that fact, though both of them noticed it plainly enough. They rode on. The country changed slowly around them as the morning wore toward noon, the flat gold grass giving way, mile by mile, to low ridges of red rock and stands of stunted pine, the air thinning and cooling as the trail began its long climb toward higher ground. Silas found himself more than once, glancing sideways at the woman riding beside him, still faintly astonished by the simple fact of her presence. 5 years he had ridden this country alone. 5 years of silence he had guarded like it was the only inheritance he had left to protect. And now there was this a voice beside him. A stubborn, clever, frightened, remarkable voice, filling up a silence he hadn't realized, until it was gone, how heavily it had been sitting on him. Tell me something, Wanling said as the sun climbed toward its highest point. That boy. In the war. Did he have a name? Silas was quiet a long moment, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves against packed dirt. I never learned it, he said finally. I've spent 17 years wishing I had. Feels wrong, somehow, carrying a man's death around without ever once carrying his name. Then carry mine instead for now, she said quietly. Wanling. Say it again so I know you meant it the first time. Wanling, he said. And something passed between them, then small, wordless, entirely unlike anything either of them had allowed themselves to feel in a very long time before the trail bent north, around a shoulder of red rock, and the moment folded itself away, and the long, hard work of the day's riding claimed them both again. He caught himself thinking, somewhere in the easy hour that followed, that he had not once checked over his shoulder toward Whisper Creek since they'd left it. 5 years he had never ridden away from that cabin without a small, quiet ache pulling at him to turn back, as if the land itself might vanish the moment he stopped watching it. Today he had ridden a full 3 hours without the ache showing up at all. He wasn't sure yet what to make of that. Wasn't sure whether it frightened him more than it should have, this quiet, unfamiliar lightness that kept finding him whenever Wanling said something sharp enough to catch him off guard, or fell silent in a way that somehow still felt like company instead of absence. He had built his whole life these past 5 years around needing no one, except a man could build a wall 100 feet high and call it peace, and it would still only ever be a wall. And walls, he was beginning to suspect, riding easy beside a woman who trusted horses less than she trusted her own 2 feet, and trusted very little else besides, had never once kept a person warm. He didn't say any of that aloud. Some things a man had to sit with a good long while before he trusted himself to say them out loud to anyone, let alone to a woman he'd known for less than a single day. It was Wanling who saw it first. She had fallen half a length behind him on the narrow trail, and when she looked back a habit she could not yet make herself stop. No matter how many miles separated them from the camp, she went very still in the saddle. Silas. Something in the way she said his name brought him around fast, his hand already dropping to the Winchester lashed against his saddle. Far behind them, small as a smudge of charcoal against the pale afternoon sky, a thin line of dust was rising along the lower trail. Not the reckless, hurried column 3 riders had thrown up the day before, something smaller, steadier, the kind of dust a man raises when he isn't in any hurry at all, because he already knows exactly where the road ahead is going to lead. Silas studied it a long moment, jaw tight. Might be nothing, he said. Might be a rancher moving cattle. Do you believe that? Wanling asked. He didn't answer right away, and that, more than anything he could have said aloud, was answer enough. We keep moving, he said finally, turning his horse back toward the climbing trail. Whoever it is, we don't give them the satisfaction of finding out we noticed. She held his gaze a moment longer, some new and steadier resolve settling behind her eyes, and then nodded once, sharp, and turned her mare, to follow him up into the red rock and pine. Behind them, the thin, dark line of dust continued its slow, patient climb along the lower trail, in no rush at all to close the distance. It didn't need to be. It had, after all, exactly 3 days to catch them. Ahead of them lay 3 days of open country, a federal marshal who did not yet know their names, and a debt that had started with wages and had somehow impossibly grown large enough now to hold 2 old soldiers, one furious railroad thief, and a woman who had once kept a dead man's books, all inside its widening reach. None of them yet knew how far it would ultimately stretch, but the road to Cheyenne was waiting, and the sun was climbing, and there was no more time left standing still. The dust kept its distance all afternoon. That was the worst part of it. Not a chase. Not yet. Just a patient smudge on the lower trail, never closing, never falling back, like a man had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for geography to do the rest of the work for him. Silas watched it more than he watched the road, because a threat you can see is a threat you can plan for. A threat that only watches you back is something else entirely. Something that gets under a man's skin and stays there, itching, until he starts hearing hoofbeats in the wind and horses in the creak of his own saddle leather. "You keep looking back," Wanling said. "You keep noticing me looking back. I notice everything," she said. "It has kept me alive so far." He almost smiled at that. Almost. The dust behind them made it hard to hold on to anything shaped like humor for very long. They rode the rest of the morning in a silence broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves and, twice, by the low warning call of a hawk circling somewhere above the ridgeline, unbothered by any of the trouble unfolding beneath it. Silas used the quiet to teach her what he could, quickly, without slowing their pace, how to check a cinch one-handed without dismounting, how to read the wind by watching the grass instead of licking a finger like some Eastern almanac insisted, how to hold a rifle steady against a moving saddle if it ever came to that. "If it ever comes to that," Wanling repeated, testing the weight of his spare revolver in her hand for the first time, turning it over slowly, unfamiliar and wary. "You say that as though it is a small thing, a minor inconvenience, like rain. Better to know and not need it," Silas said, "than need it and not know." "That is either very wise," she said, "or something men say to make themselves feel useful while frightening women half to death. Bit of both, probably." She huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh, though it tried to be, and settled the revolver's grip more securely into her palm, and did not hand it back. By mid-morning, the flat gold country had begun climbing, the grass giving way slowly to sage and broken shale, the horizon closing in on both sides as low ridges rose to meet them. Silas felt the change in the air before he saw it, properly cooler, thinner, carrying the particular mineral bite of high rock country. He had ridden through this stretch of the territory only twice before in 5 years, and both times alone, both times without a single soul depending on his judgment besides his own horse. This felt different in a way he was still working out how to name, because a man alone only had to answer to himself when a decision went wrong. A man riding beside someone else, someone he had somewhere in the last 2 days without ever quite agreeing to it, started counting as his responsibility carried the weight of every choice twice over. Once for the choosing, once for whoever else the choosing might cost. He glanced sideways at her, sitting straighter in the saddle now than she had the morning before, her grip on the reins looser, more trusting, exactly as he'd shown her. 2 days. That was all it had taken. 2 days. And already he could not entirely picture riding this stretch of country without her voice beside him, sharp and unafraid, filling up a silence he'd spent 5 years mistaking for peace. By late afternoon, the main trail had begun to climb in earnest, cutting up through broken country toward a saddle of rock. The local maps called Widow's Pass, narrow, ugly, the kind of ground a man crossed quickly or not at all. Silas knew the name. Knew, too, that the pass added the better part of a day onto the ride, winding high through timber and shale before dropping back down toward the Cheyenne Road on the far side. He also knew the low road, the easy, obvious road Vane would expect them to take. "We're leaving the main trail," he said. "For the pass. For the pass." Wanling followed his gaze up toward the gray shoulder of rock rising ahead of them, its upper reaches already catching the first thin edge of afternoon shadow. That does not look like a shortcut, she said. That looks like a place men go to disappear. That's rather the idea, Silas said. She considered that a long moment, the mare shifting restlessly beneath her. Comforting, she said, in the way that very little you say actually is. Desmond Vane had ridden out from the railroad camp himself that same morning, 3 fresh riders in tow, to meet a man he had done careful, quiet business with on 2 prior occasions. Garrett Doss kept a trading post that did more than sell flour and rope. He sold information too, to whoever paid best for it, and he had proven, across those 2 prior occasions, admirably indifferent to which side of a law his customers happened to stand on. You're certain it's them, Vane said, watching Doss's post come into view below, tucked at the base of the pass like a spider patient at the center of a very carefully chosen web. Description matches close enough, Doss said. Weathered fellow, quiet, good with a rifle, by the sound of it. Chinese woman traveling with him, exhausted, dressed rough. Word travels fast along this stretch of country, Mr. Vane. Man doesn't stay hidden out here for long, not once enough riders start asking after him. They'll come to you for the pass, Vane said. It was not a question. Everyone does, eventually, once they understand the low road isn't safe for them. Everyone does, Doss agreed. I'll guide them right into the narrows myself. Give you and your men time enough to get positioned proper along both rims before we ever get there. A pause, calculating. Same price as before. Double, Vane said. This one's worth double. Doss's easy grin didn't waver. Then I expect I'll be extra thorough about my hospitality. Vane watched the trading post a moment longer, the thin curl of smoke from its chimney, the ordinary welcoming shape of it against the darkening sky, and felt the particular cold satisfaction of a problem about to be solved through someone else's hands instead of his own. He had learned a long time ago that the cleanest violence was always the kind a man paid another man to commit at a comfortable distance. Send word once it's done, he said. I'll want that ledger back in my hands by nightfall tomorrow, and Doss. His voice sharpened. Just slightly, the girl comes back alive. Wexford's fate is entirely his own business. Hers is not, until I say otherwise. Understood, Mr. Vane. Vane turned his horse back toward the camp without another word, already composing, in the patient, methodical part of his mind that had built an entire secret fortune out of careful arithmetic. The letter he would send that same evening to a contact in Cheyenne, a second line of attack, moving forward regardless of whatever happened in the past, because a man who had climbed as far as Desmond Vane had climbed did not survive by ever depending on only one plan succeeding. They reached the outpost an hour before dusk. It wasn't much a low timber trading post crouched at the base of the pass, a corral out back holding a handful of tired horses, a hand-lettered sign nailed crooked above the door that read simply Doss Crossing Supplies, Trade, Guide. Smoke curled, thin and steady, from a stovepipe chimney. A dog, gray-muzzled and unbothered, lifted its head from the porch boards to watch them ride in, then decided they weren't worth the effort of standing, and put its head back down. The man who came out to meet them was broad through the shoulders, weathered the particular deep brown of a man who'd spent 30 years outdoors, with a beard going gray at the edges and eyes that crinkled easy and warm when he smiled. Don't get many riders through this late in the day, he said. Name's Garrett Doss. This is my place such as it is, Silas Wexford. He didn't offer more than that. Doss's gaze slid, brief and unhurried, toward Wan Ling, and something in his expression softened further, not the leering. Appraising look Silas had half braced himself for, but something closer to simple concern. You two look like you've had a hard few days, Doss said. We have, Silas said. We're headed for Cheyenne. Federal Marshal's office. Something flickered behind Doss's easy expression there, and gone so fast Silas nearly missed it entirely. Long ride from here, Doss said. Especially if you're keeping off the low road. How'd you know we're keeping off the low road? Doss laughed, easy, unbothered. Man rides up to my door at dusk instead of pushing on to make the flats before dark. I figure he's got a reason for taking the slow way. Ain't my business what it is. He gestured toward the porch. Come in. Eat something hot. I'll fill your canteens, and we can talk about the pass, if that's truly where you're headed. It's not kind country after dark. Silas hesitated, because trust these days cost him something it never used to cost before the war, before Vane, before a ledger small enough to hide in a sleeve had turned an ordinary homestead into a battlefield. He studied Doss a moment longer, the easy hands, the unhurried voice. Nothing in the man's manner pulled at the old instincts, the way Vane's soft, expensive hands had, which didn't mean the instincts were right, only that they weren't shouting yet. "Obliged," Silas said finally, and swung down from the saddle. Inside, the trading post smelled of wood smoke and coffee and dried leather. Shelves crowded with the ordinary business of frontier survival flour sacks, coils of rope, a rack of rifles behind the counter, tins of tobacco stacked in careful rows. Doss's wife, a quiet, capable woman named Ruth, set out bowls of stew without being asked twice, and for a little while, one small stolen hour, the cabin felt almost like an ordinary place, filled with ordinary people, doing ordinary kindnesses for two strangers who badly needed them. Wan Ling ate like a woman who had forgotten, somewhere in the last 2 days, that eating was even a thing bodies were still allowed to do. "Slower," Silas said quietly, echoing the exact word he'd given her under the cottonwood tree what felt now like a lifetime ago. She looked up at him, something flickering warm and rueful in her eyes. "You say that to me a great deal. Someone has to." "I am beginning to suspect," she said, "that you enjoy telling me what to do. I enjoy you still being alive to argue with me about it." That earned him something close to a real laugh, quiet, surprised out of her, gone almost as fast as it arrived, but real all the same. Across the room, Ruth Doss caught the exchange and said nothing, only smiled faintly to herself and refilled the coffee without being asked. Later, while the men talked trail conditions over a second cup of coffee near the stove, Ruth drew Wan Ling aside to a small back room to find her a clean shirt to replace the torn one she'd been wearing since the camp. It was a small kindness, the kind offered without ceremony between women who had never met before and might never meet again, and Wan Ling found herself, unexpectedly, close to tears over the simple gift of it. "You've got kind eyes," Ruth said, folding the old shirt away without comment on its condition or its history. "Man like Garrett doesn't offer to guide just anybody through that pass. He must see something in your Mr. Wexford worth the trouble." "He is not my Mr. Wexford," Wan Ling said too quickly, and Ruth's answering smile suggested she hadn't believed a word of the correction. Ruth said, in the particular tone of an older woman who has decided a younger woman is not yet ready to hear the truth about her own heart, and left it there, kind enough not to press further. Wan Ling carried that small, warm exchange with her the rest of the evening, and would think of it again, later, with a bitterness she could not have anticipated in that gentle back room, once she understood exactly what kind of household she had been so generously welcomed into. It was Garrett Doss who brought up the pass again once the bowls were cleared. "Widow's Pass'll cut the better part of a day off your ride, once you're through it," he said, settling into a chair across the rough plank table. "But it's no trail for strangers after dark. Rock slides. Bad footing. A man could ride it blind if he'd done it enough times." "You've done it enough times," Silas said, "more than I'd care to count." Doss's easy smile didn't waver. "I run supplies up to a mining camp on the far side twice a month. Know every turn of it by feel." He glanced between them. "I could guide you through come morning, save you a full day, maybe more, and keep you clear of the low road besides if that's a thing you're wanting kept clear of." Silas studied him a long moment. "Because a stranger offering exactly the thing you need most, at exactly the moment you need it most, was either the plainest kind of good fortune the territory occasionally handed out, or it was a trap dressed up in a friendly beard and a warm fire. He couldn't yet tell which was its own kind of answer if he let himself sit too long with it. "We'd be obliged," Silas said finally. He told himself it was the fastest road. He told himself the exhaustion in Wan Ling's face, the way her hands still trembled faintly even now, 2 full days removed from the running, mattered more than an unproven itch behind his ribs. He told himself several things that night, lying awake on the trading post floor, while Wan Ling slept close enough that he could hear her breathing settle, slow and even, for the first time since the cottonwood tree. He told himself all of that, and still did not entirely believe it. They left before full light. Doss rode a sturdy paint mare he clearly knew well, leading them up a game trail, behind the trading post that climbed fast into broken shale and stunted pine, the morning cold enough to fog their breath in pale ribbons. He talked easily as they rode stories of the mining camp, of winters so hard a man's spit froze before it hit the ground, of a grizzly he'd once outrun by playing dead so convincingly the bear had sniffed his boot heel, and simply walked away bored. Wan Ling, despite everything, found herself laughing more than once. Silas found himself watching Doss's hands instead of listening to the stories, watching where they rested, watching how often they strayed, unnecessary, toward the rifle scabbard lashed to his saddle. "You're quiet, Wexford," Doss said, mid-morning, glancing back over his shoulder. "Man doesn't have to talk to be listening," Silas said. "Fair enough." Doss's easy grin didn't so much as flicker. Widow's Pass proper starts about 2 hours on. Narrows down to nothing in the middle stretch single file. Rock walls close enough to touch both sides at once. Ugly country. But it spits you out less than a mile from the Cheyenne Road, other side. "Anyone else use this trail?" Silas asked. "Time to time, mostly just my mule train." A pause, so brief Silas nearly missed it. "Why do you ask?" "Man likes knowing who else might be standing in a place before he walks into it," Silas said. "Old habit. Fair habit to have," Doss said and turned back to the trail, and said nothing further on the matter. And Silas rode on behind him with the old itch behind his ribs settling into something considerably less easy to ignore. They stopped at midday to rest the horses in a stand of pine, and it was there, while Doss moved off to check his mare's shoe, that Wan Ling came and sat beside Silas on a fallen log, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his. "You don't trust him," she said quietly. "Didn't say that. You didn't need to. I have watched you not trust 3 different men in 3 days now. I am beginning to recognize the particular shape of your silence when it happens." Silas exhaled, slow, watching Doss's broad back through the trees. "Nothing he's done," he said. "Nothing I can point to and call a lie. Just a feeling, same one I used to get in the war, right before a quiet wood turned out to not be as empty as it looked. What do we do with a feeling like that?" "Watch closer," Silas said, "and keep the rifle where I can reach it faster than usual." Wan Ling was quiet a moment, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "For what it's worth," she said finally, "I trust your feelings more than I trust most men's certainties." Something in his chest loosened, hearing that small, unfamiliar, warm in a way he hadn't let himself feel in longer than he cared to count. "Don't tell Doss that," he said. "Man's liable to take it personal." "I have no intention of telling Mr. Doss anything at all," she said, "beyond what politeness strictly requires." The pass proper, Doss told them as they remounted, was still the better part of a day distant too far to clear before dark, which meant a night camped, somewhere along the approach, high in the timber, before the real climbing began come morning. They made camp that evening in a hollow ringed by lodgepole pine, the fire small and carefully shielded from any distant eyes that might be watching from the lower trail. Doss proved, if nothing else, an easy man to share a fire with, full of stories, generous with his coffee, quick to laugh at his own expense. He told them about a winter he'd nearly lost 2 fingers to frostbite, hauling supplies through this very country, held up his left hand in the firelight to show the faint white scarring across 2 knuckles as proof. "Ruth near skinned me alive when I finally made it home," he said, grinning. "Said a man fool enough to lose fingers to pride wasn't fit to keep the rest of them either." "She sounds formidable," Wan Ling said. "She is that." Something almost soft moved across Doss's weathered face. "Best decision I ever made, marrying that woman. Worst decision was ever thinking I could keep secrets from her. Never worked. Not once in 20 years. Silas watched him say it, watched the easy warmth in it, and felt the itch behind his ribs settle, just slightly, into something almost like reassurance. Almost. Because a man who spoke that plainly of his own wife's sharpness, who laughed that easily at his own old mistakes, did not sound, on the surface of it, like a man carrying a second colder purpose, folded quiet beneath his ribs. And yet, Silas had learned, a long time ago, in a war that taught him far more about the shape of deception than he'd ever wanted to know, that the warmest fires were sometimes built by the coldest hands. He said nothing of the thought aloud, only banked it, the way he banked everything dangerous, for later use. Later, once Doss had gone to check the horses and the fire had burned low, Wan Ling taught Silas 3 words in her own language home, safe, and the particular word for a debt, repaid in full, which took him 4 clumsy attempts to pronounce correctly and made her laugh, low and unguarded, in a way he hadn't yet heard from her. "Say it again," she said. "You are murdering it terribly. I heard you the first 3 times, and yet you continue to say it wrong." "Some things," he said, "a man's tongue just wasn't built for." "Then I will simply have to teach your tongue better manners," she said. And something in the firelight, in the closeness of her shoulder against his, in the low, warm sound of her laughter, made the whole cold weight of the last 3 days feel, for one brief, stolen hour, almost bearable. Their eyes held a moment longer than either of them likely intended. Because there was something happening between them that neither had asked for, and neither, if either was being honest, particularly wanted to stop. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, and hers did not look away, and for one suspended heartbeat the whole hollow, the whole fire, the whole cold mountain night seemed to narrow down to nothing but the small distance left between them, until a log popped loud in the fire, and the moment broke, and both of them looked away at exactly the same instant, equally flustered, equally unwilling to name what had very nearly happened. "It's late," Silas said, his voice rougher than he meant it. "Very late," Wan Ling agreed, entirely too quickly. Neither of them moved to sleep for several more minutes anyway. He did not reach for her hand that night. Wanted to. Didn't. Some things, he told himself, a man had to earn properly before he let himself take them, and there was still a debt to pay in Cheyenne. Still a ledger to deliver. Still a man named Vane whose reach he did not yet fully understand. And it seemed to him, lying awake long after the fire burned to embers, an unfair thing to ask a woman to build anything with him until all of that danger had finally properly been set down. He fell asleep eventually, still turning that unfairness over in his mind, unaware that morning would arrive carrying a danger considerably worse than anything he'd yet allowed himself to imagine. They rode out at first light the next morning, the air sharp and thin, the timber giving way steadily to broken shale as the trail climbed toward the pass proper. Wan Ling rode a little closer to him than strictly necessary, and neither of them commented on it, and something in the quiet ease of that closeness felt, for a little while, like the beginning of something neither of them had words ready for yet. Doss talked less that morning than he had the evening before, a small thing, easily explained by the harder climbing, the narrower footing, the need for concentration, a treacherous trail demanded. Silas noticed it anyway. Noticed, too, how often Doss's eyes strayed toward the high ridgelines on either side of the trail, quick, assessing glances that had nothing to do with weather or footing, and everything to do with something Silas couldn't yet name. "You're quiet this morning, Doss," he said, mid-morning, watching the man's shoulders. "Man doesn't have to talk to be listening," Doss said, echoing, whether he knew it or not, the exact words Silas had given him the day before. Fair enough. Silas kept his voice easy, unbothered, while every old instinct in him drew up tight and watchful. Widow's Pass proper starts about 2 hours on. Narrows down to nothing in the middle stretch single file, rock walls close enough to touch both sides at once. Ugly country. "You've described it to us twice now," Silas said. "Almost sounds like you're warning us." Doss's easy grin flickered there, then gone, replaced for half a heartbeat by something considerably colder, before the warmth slid back into place like a mask resettling. "It's being thorough," he said. "Bad ground deserves a thorough warning." "Anyone else use this trail?" Silas asked. "Time to time, mostly just my mule train." A pause, so brief Silas nearly missed it. "Why do you ask?" "Man likes knowing who else might be standing in a place before he walks into it," Silas said. "Old habit. Fair habit to have," Doss said, and turned back to the trail, and said nothing further on the matter, and Silas rode on behind him with the old itch behind his ribs settling into something considerably less easy to ignore. They rode on into the narrowing throat of Widow's Pass an hour later, the rock walls climbing steep and close on either side, until a man could nearly reach out and touch stone on both sides. At once the light thinning to a pale gray ribbon far overhead. The horses' hooves rang loud against packed shale in the sudden echoing quiet, and Silas felt the old wartime instinct pull tight across the back of his neck, the way it only ever did right before something broke loose. He did not have long to wait. The shot came from above and behind a single crack that split the narrow canyon like thunder, close enough that rock chips sprayed off the wall a foot from Wan Ling's head. Her mare screamed and reared, and Wan Ling went sideways hard, only Silas's fast lunging grab keeping her from going all the way down onto the shale. "Down!" he shouted. "Off the horses now!" More shots followed, fast, coming from both sides of the canyon rim, and through the chaos Silas saw Garrett Doss pull his paint mare hard around, not toward the danger but away from it, riding clear of the crossfire with the easy, unhurried competence of a man who had known exactly where to stand a full minute before the first shot ever rang out. "Doss," Silas roared. "You son of a personal, Wexford," Doss called back, already 30 yards clear and pulling farther by the second. "Man's got to eat same as anybody. Vane pays better than mule trains do." And then he was gone, vanished around the canyon bend. leaving Silas and Wan Ling pinned flat against a shelf of broken rock, with gunfire raining down from both rims and nowhere in any direction that looked like safety. Silas's mind went very still, not calm exactly. Something colder than calm. Something the war had carved into him a long time ago, and never quite let go of since the particular clarity that arrives only once a man accepts, fully, that the next several minutes are going to decide whether he lives or dies, and there is no longer any use wasting thought on anything except the deciding of it. "Stay low," he said. "Stay behind the rock. Whatever happens, don't stand up." "Silas, I mean it, Wan Ling." He came up, firing, two shapes on the eastern rim, muzzle flashes bright in the canyon shadow. He put a round into the rock beside the nearer one, close enough to send the man scrambling backward out of sight, and used the half-second it bought him to drag Wan Ling and both horses another 10 yards down the canyon floor toward a jumble of fallen boulders that offered something closer to real cover. More shots. Closer now. He counted at least 4 separate rifles by sound alone, positioned high on both rims, which meant this had never been a chance ambush at all. This had been planned down to the exact bend in the trail, which meant Doss had known, all along, precisely which patch of narrow canyon would trap them worst. Which meant every warm smile, every story about grizzly bears, every bowl of stew Ruth Doss had set down without being asked twice, had been nothing but careful stagecraft laid a full day in advance. He didn't have time to feel the fury that thought deserved. Not yet. He filed it away instead, the way he filed everything dangerous away in the middle of a fight, to be dealt with properly once there was breath left over for dealing with it. "How many?" Wan Ling asked, flat against the rock beside him, her voice remarkably steady, given the circumstances. "4. Maybe 5, he reloaded fast, hand sure despite the chaos. "All up high, we're pinned unless we can get eyes on where exactly they're perched." "Then get eyes on it," she said. "I did not run 3 days across half this territory to die in a hole in the ground." Something fierce and startled moved through him. Hearing that admiration, he realized, distant and strange in the middle of a gunfight, admiration for a woman who could sound that certain with bullets, cracking off rock 4 feet from her skull. He rose, fired twice fast at movement on the western rim, dropped back down before return fire found him. A round struck the boulder inches from his shoulder, sending a spray of rock dust into his eyes. And for one blind, ringing second, he thought he'd been hit before his mind caught up and told him otherwise. "Silas! I'm all right." He blinked, his vision clear, fired again, heard a shout of pain from somewhere on the eastern rim that told him at least one shot had found something more than rock. "Give me the revolver." Wan Ling pressed it into his hand without hesitation, and for one strange suspended heartbeat, their fingers overlapped around the grip, her hand steady despite everything. And something passed between them that had nothing to do with the gunfight, and everything to do with the simple, fierce fact of 2 people choosing, in the middle of dying, to trust each other completely. He fired the revolver dry in 3 careful shots, buying them another few seconds, and used those seconds to half-drag, half-carry her another stretch down the canyon floor. And that was when he saw the 5th shooter properly for the first time, a rider working his way down a narrow game trail on the canyon's southern face, closing the distance on foot now, rifle held low and ready, moving with the exact economical stillness Silas remembered from a night 3 days ago on his own front porch. Corwin Reeve. Their eyes met across 40 yards of open, deadly ground. Neither man raised his rifle. For one long, suspended moment, the whole gunfight seemed to hold its breath around them. The echo of shots still rolling off canyon walls, dust hanging thick in the thin afternoon light, and in the middle of it, 2 old soldiers looking at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with 40 yards, and everything to do with 17 years. "Corwin." Vane's voice, distant, furious, from somewhere up on the eastern rim. "What are you waiting for? Take the shot." Corwin didn't move. Silas watched him standing there, rifle half raised, some enormous internal battle playing out across his face in the space of a single-held breath, and understood with sudden and total clarity that he was watching a man decide, right now, in front of him, which version of himself he intended to be for the rest of whatever life he had left. "You don't have to do this," Silas called out, low, urgent. "Whatever he's paying you, Corwin, it isn't worth what it'll cost you." "Everything costs something, Wexford," Corwin called back, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like grief. "I've been paying for that field in Virginia every single day for 17 years, and never once found a coin that settled the bill." Then stopped paying it his way. Something cracked open in Corwin's face at that old, buried raw. Wexford, he called instead. Low, urgent. Pitch to carry only to Silas. And no farther. There's a break in the rock behind you. Narrow gap leads up out of the canyon on the blind side. I can't hold this position much longer without Vane noticing I'm not shooting straight at you. Why? Silas called back. Why give us the way out? Corwin's jaw worked, something raw and unresolved moving behind his eyes, even at this distance. Because I already let one thing happen in a war I couldn't stop, he said. Because I've spent 17 years telling myself that not stopping it made me innocent. And because I am done, Wexford. I am done being the man who watches and does nothing while somebody else falls. Come with us. Then, Silas shouted. Corwin shook his head. Slow final. No, there isn't, he said. Not for me. Man like Vane doesn't forgive a betrayal, and I've got no home left to run to even if he did. But you two do. So run, Wexford. For once in your life, let somebody else buy you the time, instead of spending it all yourself. Above them, a rifle cracked. Close, furious, one of Vane's other men. Finally registering that Corwin hadn't fired a single shot in Silas's direction the entire fight. He's helping them. The shout went up. Reeves helping them, boss. Everything happened very fast after that. Corwin spun, fired once, dropped the nearest gunman with a single shot that spoke to exactly how many years he'd spent perfecting that particular skill. And then a second rifle cracked from higher on the rim, and Corwin staggered, caught himself against the rock face. One hand pressed hard and sudden to his side. Go, he shouted down at them, blood already dark between his fingers. The gap now, while they're looking at me instead of you. Silas hauled Wan Ling up by the arm, half dragging her toward the narrow break in the canyon wall Corwin had pointed out, both horses scrambling awkward and terrified behind them over broken shale. We can't just leave him, Wan Ling gasped, twisting back toward the fallen shape against the rock. We don't have a choice, Silas said, and hated every single word of it, even as it left his mouth. Move, Wan Ling. Move now. They scrambled up through the gap as the gunfight raged, on below and behind them. Rock scraping skin raw, breath tearing ragged in both their chests, and it was only once they'd cleared the canyon rim entirely, only once the shooting had faded to distant, scattered cracks far below, that Silas allowed himself to stop, to breathe, to feel finally the full weight of what had just happened settle into his chest like a stone, drop down a well. Corwin Reeve had taken a bullet meant, in every practical sense, for him. And Silas did not yet know, crouched in the thin, cold air above Widow's Pass with Wan Ling shaking silently against his shoulder, whether that debt could ever properly be repaid, or whether some debts, once incurred in a war neither man had ever fully escaped, simply had to be carried the rest of a life, unpaid, unpayable, a weight a man learned to walk with instead of ever setting down. Behind them in the canyon, Corwin Reeve did not die. He would not learn that himself for several long, pain-blurred minutes, drifting in and out of a darkness that kept threatening to become permanent, while Desmond Vane's remaining men worked their way down from the rim to stand over him with rifles leveled and faces unreadable. Boss wants him alive, one of them said finally, when the argument over whether that mercy was worth the trouble had gone on long enough. Says a traitor who can still talk is more useful than one who can't. They bound his wound rough and without gentleness, tied his hands tighter than the injury strictly required, and slung him belly down across his own saddle for the ride back to camp alive for now, though whether that would remain a mercy or become, before long, a considerably crueler punishment than a clean bullet would have been, was a question Corwin Reeve did not have the strength left just then to properly consider. They found shelter an hour later in a shallow overhang of rock, well back from the pass, the horses tethered, close and quiet in the gathering dusk. Wan Ling's hands, when Silas finally looked at them properly in the fading light, were scraped raw from the climb, one knuckle split and bleeding, though she hadn't said a word about it the whole way up. He took her hand without asking permission, turned it gently palm up, and began cleaning the cut with water from his canteen and a strip torn from his own shirt. You don't have to do that, she said quietly. I know. I have survived a great many things without anyone tending my hands for me. I know that too. He didn't look up from his work. Doesn't mean you have to survive this one alone. She was quiet a long moment, watching him work, something unguarded moving across her face in the low orange light of the small fire he'd risked building against the overhang's back wall. That man, she said finally, Corwin. He knew you. Truly knew you. I saw it in his face, even from that distance. We served together, long time ago. Silas tied off the makeshift bandage, careful, unhurried. He was the one who dragged me back to camp, the night after the boy. The one who sat up with me those 4 nights I couldn't sleep. Man saved my life once, in every way that matters except the obvious one. And tonight he may have done it again. Silas said nothing to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have broken something loose in his chest he badly needed to keep steady a while longer. She let the silence sit a while before she spoke again, her voice softer now, further away, as though she were speaking as much to the fire as to him. I had a brother once, she said, older. Kind in the quiet way older brothers sometimes are, when they think no one is watching them be kind. He signed the contract that sent me here, because our father could not. And because he believed, we both believed, that a hard 3 years would buy our family's name back from ruin. She was quiet a moment. Word came to the camp 8 months ago that he had died in a mining accident, 2 territories east of here. I have never seen the body, never seen a grave, only a company letter typed by a clerk who never once used his given name. You don't believe it. I do not know what I believe, she said. I have learned, working Mr. Vane's books, that companies like his are exceptionally skilled at turning inconvenient people into paperwork. A death is so much tidier than a debt a man might one day question. Silas looked at her a long moment, something protective and fierce moving through him that he did not yet have a name for. When this is finished, he said, when the ledger's done its work, and Vane's answered, for it will find out the truth of what happened to him, whatever it costs. You would do that, she said, for a brother you have never met. I'd do it, he said, because you ask without asking, and because I've spent 17 years learning what it costs a man to leave a question like that unanswered. She reached over, then, and took his hand, the same hand, still faintly stained with her own blood, from the bandage he'd just finished tying, and held it a long moment in the firelight, saying nothing at all, because some gratitude ran too deep for words to carry it properly. It was searching through the small satchel Wan Ling had somehow, impossibly, managed to keep hold of through the entire scramble up the canyon wall, a habit of care so ingrained in her that she'd apparently protected the ledger, with the same instinct most people reserved for protecting their own bodies. That Silas found the second item. A folded paper, water-stained, tucked into the satchel's outer pocket, that hadn't been there when they'd left the cabin at Whisper Creek. This isn't mine, he said, frowning, unfolding it carefully in the firelight. Wan Ling leaned close. It fell from Mr. Doss's coat during the ambush. I did not have time to think about it then. I only grabbed it because it was there, and my hands needed something to hold on to besides fear. Silas read it twice before the words fully settled. It was a contractor's manifest. Old, at least 3 years old by the dates recorded on it, bearing a company seal he recognized immediately because he had once, in a leaner year before Whisper Creek, signed his own name to papers carrying that exact same mark. Continental Crescent Railway Right-of-Way Clearance Division. Beneath the seal, a list of names. Men paid. The document made plain to persuade settlers and small claim holders along a proposed rail corridor to vacate land the company wanted cleared, using whatever methods proved most efficient. Silas's own name was not on this particular list. But the pay rate, the phrasing, the careful bureaucratic distance built into every line, persuade, vague methods most efficient was identical, word for word, to a contract he himself had signed 6 years earlier, in a hard winter when farm work had dried up, and a man with his particular wartime skills had needed money more than he'd needed a clean conscience. He had done that work for 8 months, had told himself the whole while that he was merely delivering hard truths to people who'd eventually have had to leave anyway, had told himself a great many comfortable things. In fact, in those 8 months, right up until the night he'd watched a family of 4 walked off their claim at gunpoint by men he'd trained personally. He remembered it now, with a clarity he usually kept locked away as tightly as the memory of the boy in the wood. A woman, younger than he was now, clutching a child on each hip while her husband argued, useless and desperate, with 3 men Silas had shown, not 2 weeks earlier, exactly how to so a rifle looked less like a threat and more like an inevitability. He had not fired that night, had not needed to. His only contribution had been teaching the men who did the actual threatening how to do it more efficiently, and he had told himself, riding away afterward, that efficiency was not the same thing as cruelty. He had believed that lie for almost a full week, before it finally curdled in his stomach past any further ignoring. He had quit the next morning, had ridden west with what money he'd saved, and built Whisper Creek specifically as far from that memory as the territory would allow him to get. And now here it was, anyway, waiting for him at the bottom of a stranger's coat pocket, in the exact same company's handwriting, connected impossibly, inevitably to the very same system of exploitation currently trying to kill him. Silas. Wan Ling's voice, careful, watching his face in the firelight. What is it? He was quiet a long moment before he trusted himself to answer. Vane's company, he said finally. Continental Crescent. I worked for them once. Different division. Different kind of thieving, but the same company seal. The same careful language dressing up ugly work in polite words. He set the paper down like it had grown too heavy to hold. I thought I left that part of my life behind when I built the cabin. Turns out I only ever moved a few hundred miles away from it. Never actually stopped standing on the same ground. Wan Ling reached over and took his hand not to tend it this time, simply to hold it, her fingers cool and steady against his. You left, she said quietly. That is not nothing, Silas. Many men never do. Doesn't undo what I did before I left. No, she agreed, but it means the man sitting beside me tonight, bandaging my hand and risking his own life for a stranger's ledger, is not the same man who signed that contract. People are not required to remain forever, whatever they once agreed to be paid for. You truly believe that? I have watched you make 3 different choices in 3 days, she said, each one harder than the last, and every single one of them the harder, kinder choice rather than the easier, safer one. A man does not do that by accident, Silas. He does it because somewhere along the way, he decided who he wanted to become, and has been quietly becoming that man ever since, whether he gives himself credit for it or not. He looked at her a long moment in the firelight, at the steady, unflinching honesty in her face, the same quality that had made her keep a second set of books in secret for months rather than simply accept the lies she'd been ordered to write, and felt something in his chest shift, quietly, permanently, in a direction he hadn't let it move in longer than he could properly remember. We should move again before first light, he said finally, folding the paper carefully away into his own coat. Doss knows this country better than we do. He'll expect us to keep resting. Then we won't rest long, Wan Ling said. They didn't. They rode out from the overhang, while the sky was still more black than gray, exhausted, wounded in small ways neither of them mentioned aloud, following a rough game trail. Silas navigated more by instinct than any clear knowledge of the ground. The Cheyenne Road, by his reckoning, couldn't be more than half a day distant now, once they cleared this last stretch of broken country. They made it nearly 3 hours before the riders found them. 6 of them this time, emerging from a fold in the land with the kind of coordinated suddenness that told Silas immediately this hadn't been luck. Someone had known which direction to look. Someone Doss, most likely, or Vane's contacts along the Cheyenne Road that Corwin had warned them about at dawn 3 days ago, had guessed their route with an accuracy that left no room anymore for coincidence. Silas's hand went to his rifle. Wouldn't, said the lead rider, a broad man with a badge-shaped scar, where an actual badge had clearly once been pried off his coat by someone who'd taken exception to how he'd earned it. 6 guns against your one, mister. Bad math, even for a man who handled 3 of us fine enough back at that cabin. Silas did the arithmetic anyway, the way he always did, out of habit more than hope. 6 rifles, positioned in a loose half-circle that left no clean angle of retreat. Wan Ling, exposed and unarmed beside him. Both horses too spent from the night's hard riding to outrun anything. Bad math indeed. Easy, he said quietly to Wan Ling, lowering his own rifle with slow, deliberate care. Not yet. Not here. Silas, trust me, he said. We're not dying on this stretch of empty ground for nothing. Whatever comes next, we stay alive long enough to make it matter. Wan Ling's hand found his, quick, fierce, before the riders closed the last of the distance between them. Whatever happens, she said, low and urgent, whatever they do to us, do not let them see that it costs you anything. Men like this feed on fear. I have watched Mr. Vane feed on it for a year. Do not give them the meal. Something in her steadiness in that moment, the same iron composure that had carried her, running, across a quarter-mile of open prairie 3 days ago, steadied something in him too, and he squeezed her hand once, hard, before letting it go. Together, he said. However this goes. Together, she agreed. The lead rider smiled, thin and satisfied, and gestured his men forward. Rough hands closed around Silas's arms before he could so much as raise them. His rifle stripped away and tossed carelessly into the dirt, and he heard Wan Ling's sharp intake of breath as another man tore the satchel from her shoulder, the ledger, the whole hard, dangerous purpose of the last 3 days disappearing into a stranger's saddlebag like it had never mattered enough to protect in the first place. "Mr. Vane's been asking after you," the lead writer said, as rope replaced the momentary grip on Silas's wrists, cinched tight enough to numb his fingers within minutes. "Reckon it's about time you two paid him a proper visit." Wan Ling did not cry out, did not beg. She only looked at Silas across the small, terrible distance between them. Her chin lifted, her eyes bright and dry and utterly unbroken, and something passed between them in that look that neither of them would have had the words, for even if the moment had allowed for speaking. "We are still here," the look said. "Whatever comes next, we are still here, together, and that has to count for something." They rode into the railroad camp under armed guard as the sun climbed past midday, the ledger gone from Wan Ling's hands for the first time since the night she'd stolen it, Silas's own wrists bound tight enough to numb his fingers. Somewhere ahead of them in that same camp, bound to a cot in a locked supply shed, and nursing a wound that had not, in the end, killed him, a man named Corwin Reeve waited to learn what price Desmond Vane intended to extract from a traitor he had decided for now to keep alive. Ahead of them stood row after row of low barracks, the smoke of company fires rising thin against a pale sky, and at the center of it all, waiting on the porch of his private office with an expression of profound, satisfied patience, stood Desmond Vane. He did not come down to meet them. He simply waited, unhurried, as the riders drew their captive to a halt in the dust before his porch steps, and let the silence stretch a long moment before he finally spoke. "Mr. Wexford," he said, "I confess I expected you to be cleverer than this. I confess I expected your hospitality to at least involve untying my hands first," Silas said. Something flickered across Vane's face, not quite anger, closer to the particular irritation of a man who preferred his victories accompanied by proper fear and found the absence of it faintly insulting. "You've cost me a great deal of trouble," Vane said. "A guide's fee. 2 good men wounded in that canyon." And one, his gaze slid, deliberate and cold, toward the far side of the camp, considerably worse than wounded, in terms of what it's going to cost him. Wan Ling's chin came up sharp. "What have you done to Corwin?" "He's alive," Vane said, almost pleasant about it for now. "A traitor who can still talk has his uses, Miss Sue, same as a bookkeeper who can still write. I find very few men are ever entirely beyond usefulness, so long as a man is patient enough to find the right lever." "You're a coward," Wan Ling said, her voice steady despite the rope biting into her own wrists now, despite 200 pairs of exhausted, watching eyes drifting toward the porch from the nearby barracks. "A coward who pays other men to do the things he is too soft to do himself." Vane's smile thinned to something considerably uglier. "Careful," he said. "I have been remarkably patient with you, given how much trouble you've caused me. That patience is not without its limits." "Patience," Silas said, "isn't the word I'd use for a man who needed 6 guns and a paid informant to catch one drifter, and a woman who'd never held a rifle 3 days ago." The porch went very quiet. Vane descended the steps at last, slow, deliberate, until he stood close enough that Silas could see the exact moment calculations replaced anger behind the man's eyes, the particular coldness of someone deciding a punishment was worth more delivered patiently than delivered in temper. "You'll have time to reconsider that tone," Vane said quietly. "Both of you. I find a man's confidence tends to erode considerably, given the right accommodations and enough uninterrupted time to consider his circumstances." He turned to the lead rider. "The ledger goes in my office safe, immediately. Wexford in the equipment shed. Separate from Reeve, I won't have old soldiers comparing notes on my time." The woman, his gaze slid back to Wan Ling, something calculating and considerably more dangerous than simple anger moving behind it now. "The woman stays somewhere I can keep a closer eye on personally. She's proven rather too resourceful to trust to an ordinary cell." "Touch her," Silas said, low, every trace of easy sarcasm gone from his voice entirely. "And no accommodation you can build will keep me from finishing what started on my porch 4 days ago." Vane studied him a long moment, something almost like respect flickering behind the calculation. "There's the man I was warned about," he said. "Pity you didn't show him to me sooner. Might have saved us both a great deal of trouble." He nodded to his men. "Take them." Rough hands pulled them apart then, Wan Ling toward the row of company buildings nearer Vane's own quarters, Silas toward a low timber shed at the camp's edge, and in the last moment before the distance between them closed entirely, Wan Ling turned back, found his eyes cross the crowded, dusty yard, and held them. Together, she mouthed, silent, fierce, unbroken. Together, he mouthed back, and meant it with everything he had left, to mean anything with. Even as the shed door closed between them and the bolt slid home with a sound of finality that seemed, for one long cold moment, to swallow every hard-won mile of the last 4 days whole. Outside, the camp went back to its ordinary business, the ring of hammers on rail spikes, the low murmur of 200 exhausted people who had learned, the hard way, not to look too closely at whatever cruelty passed near enough to touch them. Silas sat in the dark of the equipment shed for a long while before his eyes adjusted enough to make out the shapes around him: coils of rope, a broken cartwheel, a rack of tools kept, he noted with grim interest, considerably less secure than a man guarding a prisoner should probably have allowed. His wrists were still bound, the rope cutting deep enough now to have gone past pain into a dull, distant numbness. But his mind, for the first time since the riders had found them on the trail, had gone quiet in the particular way it always did once the worst had finally happened, and there was nothing left to do but plan the way back out of it. He thought of Wan Ling, somewhere across the camp in quarters he could not see, and did not want to imagine too closely. He thought of Corwin, wounded, bound, paying at last for a choice made 17 years too late to undo the first one. He thought of the ledger, locked now in a company safe, still carrying inside it every stolen wage, every falsified manifest, every ounce of proof that could still, if it ever reached the right hands, bring this entire rotten structure down around Desmond Vane's soft, expensive hands. They had lost the road, lost the guide, lost for now the ledger itself, but they had not lost everything. Because a man who had walked away once already from work he was ashamed of, who had built a whole life out of the wreckage of one bad war and one worse decision, did not simply stop being that man the moment circumstances turned hard again, which meant whatever Vane intended to do with his patience and his accommodations and his careful, cruel calculations, he had not yet accounted for the one thing Silas Wexford still had left to spend: time, and the particular dangerous patience of a man who had learned, a long time ago in a country of grass and smoke, exactly how to wait for the moment an enemy's confidence finally outran his caution. He began quietly, methodically, working the rope binding his wrists against the rough edge of a broken cartwheel, and did not stop, and did not let himself imagine failure, because failure was not a thing intended to allow himself the luxury of considering. Somewhere in that ordinary camp noise, word was already beginning to travel, barracks to barracks, quiet as smoke, that the woman who had escaped, who had run 3 days across half the territory, and returned with a stranger willing to fight for her, was back among them now, and that she had not by any account, reaching the workers who whispered it, come back broken. The only question left now was what Desmond Vane intended to do about that, and whether Silas Wexford, locked in a dark equipment shed with his wrists bound and his rifle gone, and every hard mile of freedom stripped back down to nothing, would still find, somewhere inside himself, one more fight left to give. He intended to. Whatever it cost him this time, the rope gave way a little past midnight. Silas worked it free with the raw, patient stubbornness of a man who had spent 5 years learning that most locks this territory, wood, rope, or otherwise, eventually surrendered to whoever outlasted them. His wrists came apart bleeding and numb, and he sat a long moment in the dark of the equipment shed, flexing his fingers back to life, listening. Camp noise had thinned to almost nothing. A dog barking somewhere distant, the low creak of a windmill turning slow in a night breeze, one set of boots, unhurried, making a final round past the barracks before, presumably, whoever wore them settled somewhere warm to wait out the rest of his watch. Silas found the loose board in the shed's back wall, by feel alone the same board he'd marked 3 hours earlier, while pretending to sit slumped and defeated in the corner, because a man who looked beaten was a man nobody watched closely. He had spent those 3 hours doing more than pretending, though. He had spent them thinking, methodically, the way he used to think before a night patrol, cataloging every detail Vane's men had let slip in careless conversation just outside the shed wall. The shift change fell at midnight, sharp, because Vane ran his camp with a company man's obsession for schedule even out here at the edge of nowhere. The northern fence line sagged badly near the old supply road, unrepaired because nobody expected trouble to come from that direction, only ever from the low road south. And the man Vane had set to guard him personally had complained, twice, loudly about missing his supper. Small things. Ordinary things. Ordinary things were exactly what a man used to win a war he had no business surviving in the first place. He was not beaten. He was, in fact, very far from finished. The night air outside hit cold and sharp against his face, and for one suspended second, he simply stood there, breathing, it letting his eyes adjust to the pale wash of starlight over the camp's rows of low buildings. Because somewhere in this sprawl of barracks and company sheds, Wan Ling was being held in quarters he hadn't seen, guarded by men whose numbers he didn't know, and every second he spent standing still and breathing was a second that felt, suddenly, unforgivably wasted. Except panic would get her killed, faster than patience would. So he made himself breathe once more, slower, and let the old training take over completely. He moved, low, quick, keeping to the deep shadow along the shed walls, the old wartime instincts settling over him like a coat he'd never quite managed to take off no matter how many years he'd spent trying. He passed the blacksmith's forge, cold and silent, past a row of barracks where, even at this hour, he could hear the thin, ragged sound of someone coughing behind a thin plank wall. Mei Fong, he thought, with a fresh stab of urgency, though he had no way yet to know for certain. Twice he froze flat against a wall as a lantern swung past on some late errand, holding his breath until the light moved on, his heart hammering loud enough in his own ears that he half expected it to give him away on sound alone. It didn't. The second shed sat closer to the camp's northern edge, smaller, more heavily watched, a single guard posted at the door, rifle slung loose across his back, more interested in the warmth of his own coat than in any real vigilance. Silas came up behind him without a sound. It was over in seconds. Quiet. Efficient. The particular ugly economy of a man who had learned this exact skill in a war and had spent 17 years wishing he'd never needed to learn it at all. He dragged the bolt free and stepped inside. Corwin. A shape stirred in the darkness, chained by one wrist to a support post, blood-dried, dark and old across the bandage. At his side, Wexford. Corwin's voice came out rough, disbelieving. You're supposed to be locked up same as me. Wasn't much of a lock. Should have guessed. Something that might, in better circumstances, have been a laugh moved through Corwin's chest and turned immediately into a wince. Vane's men took my gun. Left the chain, though. Guess they figured a bleeding man wasn't worth the extra rope. Silas worked the chain free, with the length of iron scavenged from the equipment shed, hand steady despite the urgency, clawing at his chest. Can you walk? I can walk, Corwin said, testing his weight, jaw tight against the pain. Walking's easy. It's the running I'm less sure about. Then we won't run. Not yet. Silas helped him upright, felt the man lean harder against his shoulder than either of them wanted to admit aloud. Wan Ling. Where would he keep her? Corwin was quiet a moment, something dark moving behind his eyes. His private quarters, he said finally. Back of the main office, past where they took the ledger. He doesn't trust cells for people he considers valuable. Keeps them close, keeps them watched personally. How many men? 2, usually. Maybe 3 tonight if he's spooked by how this went sideways. Corwin's hand found Silas's arm, gripping hard. Wexford. There's something else. Something I heard through the wall while they had me tied up in there, waiting on Vane to decide what to do with me. Tell me walking. They moved together through the dark, slow, careful, and Corwin talked low and fast as they went. Vane's not the top of this, he said. Never was. I've carried enough letters for him over the years to know that much, even if I never once let myself think too hard about what they said. There's a man back east, territorial delegate, name of Whitfield, who's had his hand in this operation since before I ever signed on. Vane skims wages. Whitfield skims Vane. Government contracts, land grants, votes bought quiet on the territorial council. The whole rotten thing runs 3 layers deep, and Vane's only the layer closest to the dirt. Something cold settled in Silas's chest, hearing that. Which means even if we bring Vane down, the rot doesn't stop, Corwin finished. Not unless somebody with real authority knows to keep digging past him. Then we make sure they know. They reached the rear of the main office as a sliver of moon slid finally clear of cloud cover, throwing pale light across a locked door. Silas recognized immediately from the layout Corwin had described Vane's private quarters, a single guard posted, half asleep against the frame. Silas dealt with him the same quiet way he'd dealt with the first. The room beyond was dark, narrow. A single lamp burned low on a writing desk cluttered with correspondence. Silas didn't have time yet to properly read. And in the corner, on a narrow cot, sat Wan Ling awake, alert, her wrists bound in front of her, her chin lifting sharp and fierce the instant the door swung open. She had not slept. He understood immediately from the set of her shoulders, from the careful, watchful stillness of a woman who had spent every hour since her capture calculating, planning, refusing to let a locked door convince her that the fight was already finished. Silas. Her voice broke on his name in a way he felt in his chest like a physical blow. I told you, he said, crossing the room fast, working at the rope, binding her wrists with hands that shook now for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Together. However this goes. You came. Did you doubt it? Not for one single moment, she said, and something in the way she said it, fierce and certain even after everything the last day had cost her, undid something in his chest that had stayed carefully guarded for 17 years. The rope fell away. She was up, into his arms before either of them fully decided it, and for one long, suspended breath neither of them said anything at all, because some relief ran too deep for words to properly carry it. He felt her trembling. Finally, now that the danger had a shape she could hold on to, instead of only imagine, and he held her a moment longer than the urgency of their situation strictly allowed, because some things mattered even in the middle of a rescue, perhaps especially in the middle of one. Vane came in twice, she said quietly, against his shoulder. Once to gloat, once I think simply to see whether fear had finally caught up with me. I did not give him the satisfaction either time. I never doubted that either, Silas said, until Corwin's voice, low and urgent from the doorway, broke the moment apart. We need to move. Now. Before Vane's night watch changes and somebody notices 2 empty sheds. Wan Ling pulled back, already scanning the room with a clerk's sharp, practiced eye. The correspondence, she said, moving to the desk before Silas could stop her. If what Corwin says is true, there will be proof of it here. Vane is not a careful enough man to keep such dangerous knowledge only in his head. She sorted through the papers fast, precise. The same discipline that had once let her keep 2 sets of books in perfect secret now turned toward tearing apart the very system that had tried to bury her for it. Silas watched her work, watched the quick, certain movement of her hands, and felt something close to awe move through the fear still gripping his chest. Here, she said finally, pulling free a bundle of letters bound with twine, the topmost bearing a wax seal Silas didn't recognize but understood immediately mattered a great deal. Correspondence. Territorial Delegate Aldous Whitfield's own hand, unless I am very much mistaken about whose signature this is. That's him, Corwin said grimly, glancing at it. That's the man. Silas tucked the bundle inside his coat alongside the manifest he'd cured since Widow's Pass. Then we have everything we need, he said. Now we just need to live long enough to deliver it. They had barely reached the door when a voice, low and urgent and entirely unexpected, stopped them cold. Wait. Wan Ling turned first, and Silas watched her whole body go rigid, watched the color drain from her face in the thin lamplight, as a figure stepped from the shadow of an adjoining storeroom, thin, gaunt, dressed in the rough clothes of camp labor, favoring one leg badly, a face that had clearly once been softer, before months of whatever this camp had done to it. Liang, Wan Ling whispered. The man froze. Wan Ling, he said, his voice cracked entirely apart on her name. They told me you were dead. They told me you tried to run and the desert took you. They told me the same of you, she said, and crossed the small distance between them in 3 unsteady steps, her hands finding his face like she needed to confirm, by touch alone, that he was truly real and not some cruel trick her exhausted mind had finally decided to play on her, a mining accident. 8 months ago. I mourned you, Liang. I have carried your death with me every single day since. There was no accident, Liang said bitterly, his hands closing tight around hers. Vane kept me. Hidden. A lever. In case you ever proved troublesome with what you knew. He let word reach the camp that I had died, so no one would come looking, and he has kept me exactly here, exactly like this, for 8 months to make certain you never grew brave enough to threaten him properly. 8 months, Ling repeated, the words barely holding together. Liang. I signed nothing, I said nothing. I only kept his books and hated myself a little more with every false number I recorded, and the whole while you were here, close enough to touch. And I never once. You could not have known. Liang said, gripping her hands harder. When we were small, how father used to say that worry spent on what a person cannot yet see is worry wasted twice over. Once on the fear itself, and once again when the truth finally arrives and proves the fear was never the whole shape of the thing. His voice caught. I told myself that every single night in this place, Wan Ling, that you would come back for me eventually, once you understood the truth. I never once believed you had simply given up. Something in Silas's chest went cold and furious in equal measure, watching this, because here, finally, was the full ugly shape of what Vane's kind of cruelty actually cost. Not merely wages, not merely dignity, a man's entire existence hidden away and weaponized, turned into nothing more than a leash on his own sister's courage. We're leaving, Silas said quietly, all three of us. Tonight. Liang looked at him, wary, uncertain. Who is this? A friend, Wanling said, and the simple, certain warmth in the words settled something in Silas's chest, even in the middle of everything still unfolding around them. The truest one I have found in this entire territory. They moved fast after that, the four of them, together now, slipping between shadowed buildings toward the camp's edge where Silas had marked, hours earlier from his shed, the weakest stretch of the perimeter fence. They very nearly made it. A shout went up behind them, when they were still 50 yards short of the tree line, a guard, more alert than his fellows, spotting movement where movement wasn't meant to be. Lanterns flared to life across the camp behind them, voices rising fast into the particular controlled chaos of men trained to respond to exactly this kind of alarm. Run, Silas said. Now. Don't stop for anything. They ran. Liang stumbled twice on his bad leg, and both times Silas hauled him upright without breaking stride. And both times Liang said nothing except a fierce, wordless sound of gratitude and kept running anyway, because stopping now was not a thing any of them could afford to consider. Behind them, the camp came fully awake shouts, the thud of boots, somewhere a rifle cracking to the night sky as warning rather than aim, and it was in the middle of that chaos, breaking from the shadow of the last barracks row, that Desmond Vane himself appeared, a revolver in one hand, and an expression of pure, cold fury replacing every trace of his earlier patience. "Stop them," he bellowed. "Stop them now, or every one of you answers to me personally." What happened next, Silas would only ever piece together properly in memory afterward, because in the moment itself it unfolded too fast for anything but pure instinct to carry him through it. A door burst open in the nearest barracks. Then another. Figures poured out into the lantern-lit chaos, not fleeing, not this time, but moving with sudden, deliberate purpose toward the very men Vane had ordered to stop the escape. Silas recognized, in flashes, faces he'd never met but somehow already understood: laborers, exhausted, furious, armed with nothing more than shovels and pick handles, and 8 months of accumulated, righteous anger, throwing themselves bodily into the path of Vane's scattered guards. Meifong organized this 3 days ago. Wanling gasped, breathless, as they pushed forward through the widening chaos. The moment word reached the barracks that I had returned and had not come back broken. She has been waiting only for the right moment. This is the moment, Silas said grimly, and fired a single warning shot that sent 2 of Vane's men scrambling for cover rather than pursuit. A guard lunged from the shadow of the mess hall, rifle raised, and Corwin took him down with a single economical blow before the man could get a shot off, staggering afterward against a support post, his wound clearly costing him more than he was willing to admit aloud. "You should be resting," Silas said. "I'll rest," Corwin said, "once this is finished." Not one moment before. Vane, caught suddenly in the middle of a camp, turning against him from every direction at once, wheeled towards Siklas, with something close to genuine panic finally cracking through his composure. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he snarled, revolver rising. "This goes far beyond me, beyond this camp. Men considerably more powerful than either of us have built fortunes on exactly this arrangement, and they will not simply let one drifter and his what?" Silas said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet, very final. "Say it. Finish that sentence, Vane, and see what happens next. Whitfield will bury this." Vane spat, half to Silas, half to himself, the particular unraveling logic of a man watching his entire carefully constructed world collapse in real time. He has buried worse than this before. Federal investigators, territorial judges, a newspaper editor in Laramie, who thought he'd found a story 2 years back, all of it handled, quietly, permanently. You think a ledger and a bundle of old letters changes any of that? I think. Silas said, that you're about to find out. Vane's finger tightened on the trigger. He never got the chance to fire. Corwin's shot took the revolver clean out of his hand, the weapon spinning away into the churned dirt, Vane himself staggering back with a cry of pain and fury, clutching a hand that would, Silas suspected, never hold a gun with quite the same confidence. 17 years, Corwin said, lowering his own weapon slowly, his voice carrying clear across the sudden, ringing silence that followed the shot. And that's the first time I've ever fired a gun and felt like I was actually fixing something, instead of breaking it. Vane sank to his knees in the dirt, cradling his ruined hand, and the fight seemed to go out of him all at once, the careful architecture of his entire operation collapsing as fast and as completely as the camp itself had turned against him. It's done, Vane, Silas said, standing over him now, Wanling and Liang close behind, the bundle of letters and the old manifest still safe inside his coat. Whatever comes next for you, it's finished tonight. Around them, the camp's uprising was already resolving itself into something calmer, more deliberate laborers binding the last of Vane's scattered guards, Meifong herself, thin and fever-bright but unmistakably alive, directing the effort with the same quiet authority Wanling had once described her holding over the camp sick and dying. We ride for Cheyenne, Silas said. Tonight, before Whitfield or anyone else connected to this learns what's happened here and moves to bury it deeper. I'm coming, Corwin said. So am I, Liang said, still gripping his sister's hand like he feared, even now that letting go might prove this was only ever a fevered dream. Wanling looked at all of them a long moment, her brother returned from the dead, a wounded soldier finally spending his redemption on something worth the cost, and a man who had once offered her nothing more than a canteen and had ended up offering her, somehow, an entire second chance at a life she'd thought this territory had already taken from her. Then let us finish what we started, she said, before the sun comes up on any more of Mr. Vane's lies. Before they rode out, Meifong found them at the camp's edge, thinner than Wanling remembered, but standing straighter than the fever had allowed and longer than either woman cared to count. A handful of other workers gathered quiet and watchful behind her. You will come back, Meifong said. It was not quite a question. I will come back, Wanling promised. Whatever happens in Cheyenne, I will not let this camp be forgotten the moment I am no longer standing inside it. Meifong studied her a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind eyes that had seen far too much hardship for a woman her age to have carried alone. We will hold this place until you do, she said. It is ours now. We do not intend to hand it back to anyone who thinks otherwise. Wanling embraced her, quick and fierce, and Silas watched the exchange with a fullness in his chest he hadn't expected a railroad camp, of all places, to ever make him feel. They rode out of the ruined camp as the eastern sky finally began, at long last, to pale toward dawn. 5 riders now instead of 2, carrying between them enough evidence to bring down not merely one corrupt foreman, but the whole careful architecture of theft and cruelty he had built his fortune upon. Behind them, the camp that had held 200 people in quiet, grinding bondage for the better part of a year stood finally blessedly in the hands of the very people it had spent so long trying to break. The ride to Cheyenne took the better part of 2 days, slower than any of them would have liked, Corwin's wound and Liang's ruined leg demanding rest they could barely afford to spare. They stopped twice at ranches along the way, strangers who asked no questions and offered water and dried beef without expecting payment, the particular quiet decency of a territory that had learned, over hard years, to help its own without needing the whole story first. Silas used those long, slow miles to teach Wanling something new: not how to ride. Not anymore. She had that well enough now, but how to hold herself, steady and unflinching, for the harder conversations still waiting for them in Cheyenne. They will try to make you doubt yourself, he told her, on the second evening, watching the fire he'd built throw long shadows across her tired, resolute face. Men like Whitfield's lawyers, if it comes to that. They will find every small inconsistency, every place your memory doesn't match exactly what the ledger says, and they will use it to make a room full of strangers wonder if you're lying. I am not lying. I know that. You know that. Doesn't mean it'll be easy to prove to men who've never once had to fight for anything the way you have. She was quiet a moment, watching the flames. Then I will simply have to be exactly as precise standing in front of them, she said finally, as I was standing in front of Vane's ledger every single night for the better part of a year. Precision, Silas, has never once failed me. I do not intend to let it start now. Ahead of them lay Cheyenne, and a federal marshal who did not yet know their names, and the last hard stretch of road standing between everything they had already survived, and whatever justice the territory still had left to offer them. Marshal Tate Griffin had seen a great many strange things walk through his office door in 11 years of federal service. But 5 exhausted riders, one bleeding, one gaunt with months of captivity, one carrying a bundle of evidence that would, within the hour, prove to be the most significant corruption case his office had handled since statehood talks began, was not a combination he'd ever quite prepared himself for. He listened to the whole account without interrupting once, his expression growing steadily grimmer as Wan Ling laid the ledger's contents out with the same precise, unforgiving clarity she'd once used to explain them to Silas beneath a lantern in a cabin 4 days and a lifetime ago. He asked sharp, careful questions when she finished, testing her account the way a good lawman always tested a story that mattered this much, and she answered every single one without hesitation, without contradiction, her voice never once wavering from the same calm, exact discipline that had kept her alive through everything the last year had thrown at her. By the time she finished, even Griffin's professional composure had visibly cracked into something closer to open admiration. This ledger alone, Griffin said finally, turning pages slow and careful, would see Vane in federal prison for the rest of his natural life. This he lifted the bundle of Whitfield's correspondence, his jaw tightening visibly. This is considerably larger than one foreman skimming wages. If even half of what's implied here holds up, Delegate Whitfield's entire career, and likely several others besides, is about to come apart very publicly indeed. Will it be enough, Silas asked, to actually stop it? Griffin considered that a long moment, weighing something Silas suspected, went beyond simple legal calculation. Enough to start, he said finally. Men like Whitfield build their protection in layers, same as men like Vane build their fortunes in the shadow of bigger men. Pulling one thread rarely unravels the whole coat at once. But it's a start, Mr. Wexford. A real one. More than this territory's had in longer than I care to admit. He looked to Wan Ling, to Liang standing close beside her, to Corwin holding himself upright through sheer stubborn will, despite a wound that clearly needed proper tending. You'll all need to give formal statements, Griffin said. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy. Men with money to lose rarely go down without trying to take a few honest witnesses with them on the way. We understand, Wan Ling said. We did not come this far to stop now. Griffin studied her a moment longer, something like genuine respect settling into his weathered features. No, he said, I don't imagine you did. Desmond Vane was arrested within the week, transported east under federal guard to await trial on charges that would, in the months that followed, expand considerably beyond simple wage theft into fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy, the last charge carrying implications that stretched, exactly as Griffin had predicted, considerably higher than one railroad camp's foreman. He did not go quietly. He hired the best lawyers his remaining money could still buy, and for a while it seemed almost possible that money alone might purchase him a way out of the consequences he'd spent years building for himself. His attorneys petitioned for delay after delay, challenged the legality of how the ledger had been obtained, tried twice to have Wan Ling's testimony dismissed on grounds that a woman's bookkeeping could not reasonably be trusted over a company man's sworn word. Griffin fought every motion personally and told Silas plainly, one evening over coffee in his cramped office, that the trial would likely stretch well into winter before a jury ever heard a closing argument. Justice in this territory doesn't move fast, Griffin said, especially not against a man who spent years learning exactly which levers to pull to slow it down further. You'll need patience, Mr. Wexford. More of it than you've likely got left after everything you've already spent. I've got plenty, Silas said. I spent 17 years being patient with the wrong thing. Figure I can manage a winter being patient with the right one. The 5 of them stayed close to Cheyenne through those long autumn months, taking small work where they could find it, Silas hauling freight, Corwin mending fences for a rancher outside town, despite a wound that ached worse in cold weather, Liang keeping careful books for a mercantile that paid him fairly for the first time in his life, Wan Ling and Mei Fong tending the sick in a boarding house that had, without much ceremony, become something like a temporary home for all of them. It was not an easy season. There were nights the whole arrangement felt fragile, provisional, built on nothing sturdier than the hope that a jury somewhere down the line would finally agree that the truth mattered more than the money arrayed against it. There was one such night, in late November, when an early blizzard trapped all five of them together in the boarding house parlor for the better part of 2 days, the wind howling loud enough against the shutters that conversation became, for long stretches, the only entertainment available to any of them. It was Mei Fong who finally broke a particularly heavy silence, asking Silas, with the blunt directness of a woman who had long since stopped having patience for careful small talk, whether he had ever once regretted stopping for a stranger on his own land. Not once, Silas said. Not for one single hour, blizzard or no blizzard, even knowing everything it would cost you. Mei Fong pressed. Your peace, your solitude, nearly your land itself. Especially knowing that, Silas said. A man can spend his whole life protecting an empty kind of peace, Mei Fong. Took me 38 years and one bad decision on a battlefield to learn there's a difference between peace and simply being alone, long enough to stop noticing you're lonely. Corwin, mending a saddle strap by the fire, made a low sound that might have been agreement, or might have been an old soldier's particular way of avoiding an emotion too large to speak plainly. Liang, watching his sister across the room, said nothing at all, though something in his face suggested he understood the sentiment considerably better than he let on. Wan Ling reached over and took Silas's hand without comment, and the fire burned low, and outside the wind kept howling, and none of them, in that crowded little parlor, felt nearly as trapped as the storm might otherwise have made them. But Wan Ling's ledger proved too precise to argue with, too carefully documented across too many months, and Corwin's own testimony, a former soldier turned reluctant company enforcer, describing in plain, unflinching detail exactly how the operation had run, carried a weight in that courtroom that no amount of clever lawyering could fully undo. Corwin took the stand, still favoring his wounded side, and when Vane's attorney tried, cruelly, to suggest his testimony was nothing more than a bitter man settling an old grudge against his former employer, Corwin answered with a steadiness that silenced the whole room. I'm not settling anything, he said. A grudge is something you carry hoping to get even. I'm not hoping for even. I'm hoping that saying this out loud, in front of a judge who can actually do something about it, means one less camp gets run the way that one was. That's not a grudge, counselor. That's the only kind of repayment a man like me is left to offer. The attorney had no answer ready for that, and sat down without further questions. Silas sat through every day of the trial he was able to attend, watching Wan Ling on the witness stand answer question after hostile question with the same unshakable calm she'd shown him that very first night beneath his own lantern light, and felt something fierce and proud move through his chest each time she refused to let a single one of Whitfield's expensive attorneys rattle her composure. Vane was convicted on 11 counts in the first bitter week of winter. The judge, a stern, unsentimental man from Omaha, who had clearly grown tired of watching territorial corruption escape real consequence, handed down a sentence long enough that Vane would, by any reasonable calculation, spend the greater part of what remained of his life behind federal walls. Territorial Delegate Aldous Whitfield resigned his position abruptly 2 months later, in the early weeks of the new year, citing health concerns that satisfied almost no one following the story in the territorial papers, and a federal investigation into the broader network of bribery and stolen wages connecting Continental Crescent Railway to half a dozen camps across 3 territories continued, slow and grinding, for the better part of the year that followed. Garrett Doss was tried separately, that same winter, on charges of conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder. His easy grin notably absent from the courtroom sketches the territorial papers ran throughout the proceedings. He was convicted and sentenced to a term considerably shorter than Vane's, a fact that struck Silas, reading about it afterward, as a strange kind of justice the man who had smiled warmest, while leading them into the trap, paying, in the end, the smallest price of anyone involved. Ruth Doss did not attend a single day of her husband's trial, and filed for the dissolution of their marriage before the verdict was even returned. It did not fix everything. Silas understood that clearly enough, sitting in Marshal Griffin's office through that long, gray winter, giving his 4th and then 5th formal statement, watching the slow, imperfect machinery of justice grind forward one careful document at a time. Some debts he had learned a long time ago never got repaid in full. Some wrongs stayed only ever partially righted, no matter how hard a person fought for better. But partially righted, He was beginning to understand, still mattered enormously more than left entirely alone. There was one debt, though, that no courtroom in Cheyenne could ever settle for him, and Silas knew it the whole, while he sat giving his careful, honest statements about Vane and Whitfield and a system built on stolen wages. He found the family in the spring, nearly a year after that first terrible night on his own porch, after months of careful, quiet inquiry, conducted in whatever hours the trial and its endless paperwork left him the same family he'd once watched, walked off their claim at gunpoint by men he'd trained, living now in a cramped rented room above a feed store in a town 2 days' ride from Cheyenne, considerably poorer than the land they'd lost should ever have left them. The husband, older now grayer, answered the door, with the particular wariness of a man who had learned the hard way not to trust strangers arriving unannounced. Silas did not ask forgiveness. He understood, standing there, hat in hand, that forgiveness was not his to request, and certainly not theirs to owe him. He simply told them the truth plainly, without excuse, exactly the way Wanling had once taught him. A hard thing could be spoken honestly instead of dressed up comfortable. He told them what he'd done, what role he'd played. He told them, too, about the ledger, about the trial, about a woman who had taught him that silence about an old wrong was its own kind of second wrong, compounding quietly for as long as a man let it. The wife had come to stand in the doorway by then, a child now nearly grown standing wary behind her skirts, and she studied Silas with an expression that held, in equal measure, old grief and something almost like curiosity at a stranger willing to say aloud what most men prefer to bury. "You could have simply stayed away," she said nothing. "Carried it quiet, the way most men do." "I could have," Silas agreed. "Spent 17 years doing exactly that with something else. Didn't leave much room in me for anything else to grow, carrying it that way. Figured this one deserved better than the same treatment." He handed over, without ceremony, a sum of money considerably larger than the wages that single unforgivable job had ever paid him, along with the deed to a small parcel of grazing land near Whisper Creek he'd quietly purchased for exactly this purpose. "I can't undo what happened to you," he said. "I know that, but I can make certain it wasn't nothing to me either. Wasn't just a job I walked away from and never thought about again." The husband studied him a long moment, something complicated and unresolved moving behind tired eyes. "Why now?" he asked finally. "Why after all these years?" "Because I met somebody," Silas said, "who taught me that a man doesn't get to call himself decent just by staying quiet about the indecent things he's done. He has to actually do something about them, even years too late, even when it costs him something, to finally say it out loud." The husband did not shake his hand, did not offer him coffee or a chair, or any of the small courtesies a visitor might ordinarily expect. But he did, eventually, nod once, a small, grudging, unmistakable acknowledgement, and that single nod was, Silas understood, likely the most he had any right to hope for. He did not know, riding away, whether the money or the land or the plain, unflinching truth of his confession had done anything at all to ease what that family had suffered. But he knew, for the first time in 17 years, that he had finally stopped merely running from the shape of his own worst choices, and had instead turned to face them directly, and had found, standing there in the doing of it, something that felt, at long last, considerably closer to peace than guilt had ever managed to offer him. Whisper Creek stood exactly as they had left it, the fence still half mended, the cottonwood shadow stretching long and familiar across ground that had, in the better part of a year since they'd first ridden away from it toward Cheyenne, come to mean something entirely different to the man returning to it now. Silas dismounted slow, taking in the small, sturdy shape of the cabin he'd built log by log across 5 careful, solitary years, and felt something in his chest settle that had been unsettled for a very long time before that. "It's smaller than I remembered," Wanling said, coming to stand beside him, her brother a few steps behind, still moving carefully on a leg that would, the camp doctor had warned, likely never fully heal from months of forced labor and neglect. "It's exactly the same size it always was," Silas said. "You've just gotten used to bigger country these last 6 weeks. Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps a place simply looks different, once a person has something worth measuring it against." He looked at her a long moment in the golden late afternoon light, at the quiet, hard-won peace finally settling into features that had carried, for so long, nothing but fear and calculation, and the particular exhaustion of a person fighting a war she'd never asked to fight. "I have the deed," he said. Came through last week, official, unquestionable. Land office finally admitted there was never any real case against it. Whitfield's clerk in Cheyenne turned state's evidence rather than face charges of his own. Once it became clear which way this whole thing was breaking. Then it is truly yours, Wanling said. Finally. Completely. Ours, Silas said, and watched something bright and startled move across her face at the word, if you're willing to make it that. I know it's not much. Small cabin. Harder winters than you've likely ever imagined. But it's honest ground, and I'd rather build whatever comes next on it with you than build anything at all without you. Wanling was quiet a long moment, her eyes bright, her hand finding his without hesitation. I ran across a quarter-mile of open prairie once, she said, toward a stranger with a canteen, because some part of me understood, even in the middle of the worst terror I have ever known, that this land held something worth reaching for. A small, unsteady smile. I do not intend to stop reaching for it now, simply because the running has finally ended. He kissed her then, slow and certain, in the long gold light of a Wyoming evening, with her brother tactfully studying the horizon a respectful distance away, and the whole hard-won quiet of the territory, settling soft and permanent around them both. That kiss was not an ending. It was only the first quiet promise of everything that followed, a promise kept, slowly and deliberately, across the seasons that came after, the way every good thing at Whisper Creek had always been built, one careful choice at a time. They rode into Larkspur together the following week, for supplies, and for the small, ordinary pleasure of simply being seen together in daylight, by people who had no reason left to look at either of them with suspicion. Odalie Frame came out from behind her counter the moment she recognized Silas, her sharp eyes taking in Wanling beside him, the easy way their hands found each other without either of them seeming to notice they'd done it. Well, Odalie said, something warm and knowing crossing her weathered face. About time you brought somebody worth slipping extra candy to. You knew about the candy, Silas said. Everybody in this county knew about the candy, Mr. Wexford. You were the only one who thought it was a secret. She turned to Wanling, appraising, proving. You'll do just fine out here, dear. Man's been needing somebody sharp enough to keep up with him for longer than he'd ever admit. Wanling laughed, bright and unguarded, and Silas found himself laughing too, easy and unfamiliar, in a way 5 years of careful solitude had nearly convinced him he'd forgotten how to do. Corwin Reeve stayed through that first winter, mending slow in the small room Silas built onto the cabin's east side, and rode on the following spring toward a federal marshal's recommendation and a fresh start in a territory considerably farther from the ghosts of a war neither man had ever fully outrun. The morning he left, Silas walked with him out to the cottonwood tree, both of them quiet for a long while, watching the pale spring light move slow across land that had, over one hard winter, become something closer to a shared history than either of them had expected it to. You could stay, Silas said. There's work enough here for 2 men. There is, Corwin agreed. But I've spent 17 years running from one field in Virginia, Wexford, and I think I finally understand I can't outrun it by staying still in one place either. Maybe moving is just how some of us carry it properly. Not to escape it, just to keep it from settling too heavy in any one spot. You saved both our lives in that canyon. Seemed like the least I owed, Corwin said, after 17 years of owing considerably more than that, and never once paying it forward. He held out his hand, and Silas took it, and something passed between them that neither man needed words for anymore. Take care of her, Wexford, and take care of yourself. For once, same as you'd take care of anybody else you loved. I intend to. Liang came out to see him off as well, leaning on a cane he no longer strictly needed but had grown fond of regardless, and shook Corwin's hand with a solemnity that surprised them both. My sister told me what you did in that canyon, Liang said. I did not have the chance to thank you properly, in all the chaos of the camp and the trial afterward. Wasn't looking for thanks? I know, Liang said. That is precisely why it is worth giving anyway. Corwin rode east that morning, and though the two of them would not meet again for the better part of 3 years, he wrote, twice a year, careful letters that said little and meant everything. And Silas kept every one of them in the same drawer where he'd once kept a revolver he no longer needed to sleep with quite so close at hand. One letter, arriving the autumn of the wedding itself, only a week too late to reach him before the ceremony, read simply, heard you married her. Good. A man ought to build something with his life besides the fence he hides behind. Tell her I said the debt from that canyon still isn't settled, and I don't expect it ever fully will be, and that I've made my peace with owing it forever. Some things are better carried than paid off. Cr. Silas read it aloud to Wan Ling on the porch that same evening, and she was quiet a long moment afterward, turning the folded paper over once in her hands before passing it back. He is wrong about one thing, she said. Which thing? The debt was settled the moment he chose. Not to fire on you in that canyon, she said. Everything since has simply been a man learning to believe his own settled accounts. Some ledgers. Silas closed the instant. The right choice is finally made. The rest is only a man being slow to trust his own arithmetic. Liang, once his leg healed enough to allow it, took up work at the growing settlement outside Cheyenne, and within 2 years had opened a small trading office of his own honest books, fair wages, the particular quiet triumph of a man rebuilding, deliberately and carefully, everything a corrupt system had once tried to take from him. He hung a single framed document on the wall behind his own desk, in a place every client who walked through his door would see it clearly. A plain hand-copied page of accounting, dates and figures, and honest wages laid out in a clerk's careful hand, with a small note beneath it in his own writing. Every number here is true. My sister taught me that a business built on anything less is not truly a business at all, only a slower kind of theft. When Silas visited the office for the first time, Liang showed him the frame with unmistakable pride. Your sister would tell you that's a strange thing to hang on a wall, Silas said. My sister, Liang said, would tell me it is the only thing worth hanging on any wall. He smiled, something easy and unguarded that Silas had rarely seen on him in the camp. I learned that from watching her work all those months. Some lessons a man only truly learns by watching someone else pay the price of not learning them sooner. Wan Ling never returned to keeping anyone else's secrets. Instead, within the first year, she began traveling the rail camps still scattered across the territory, teaching laborers Chinese and otherwise, men and women both how to read a contract properly before signing it, how to recognize the particular careful language men like Vane had once used to disguise theft as generosity. Mei Fong, her health slowly recovered thanks to proper rest and medicine finally paid for honestly, traveled with her most seasons, the two women having become, somewhere in the long grinding months of the trial and its aftermath, something closer to sisters than merely two survivors of the same cruelty. At the first camp she visited, a rough tent settlement 2 days north of Whisper Creek, a young laborer barely out of boyhood asked her, warily, why a woman who had already won her own freedom would bother riding so far to help strangers keep theirs. Because freedom kept quietly by one person, Wan Ling told him, spreading a sample contract across an overturned crate for the whole gathered group to examine, is only ever one clever foreman away from being taken back. I did not survive Mr. Vane's camp by being lucky. I survived it by learning to read every word he never wanted me to understand. That is the only inheritance worth leaving behind, not money, not land, but the plain, stubborn ability to see exactly what is being done to you, so it can never again be done in silence. She held up the contract, pointing to a clause buried deep in dense, deliberately confusing language. Here, she said, read this line very carefully. This is exactly how they take from you, without ever once appearing to take anything at all. The laborers leaned in close, and for the better part of that cold afternoon, Wan Ling taught them, word by careful word, the same discipline that had once kept 2 sets of ledgers secret inside her own sleeve, only now spent teaching others to protect themselves, rather than spent surviving alone. It was slow, unglamorous work, welcomed by some camps and resisted bitterly by others, but she pursued it with the same unshakable discipline that had once kept 2 sets of books in perfect secret for months on end, and word of the quiet, precise woman who taught workers to protect themselves began slowly to travel farther than either of them had ever expected, as far east as Omaha. Eventually, where a reform-minded newspaper ran a lengthy account of her work that Liang clipped carefully and mailed home with unmistakable pride. That single article, small and unremarkable as it seemed pinned to the wall of Liang's trading office, did more than either Wan Ling or Silas fully understood at the time. A young territorial lawyer in Laramie read it and began, the following year, drafting the first serious proposal for wage protection laws the territory had ever seriously debated. A missionary teacher in a camp 200 miles west read it and wrote to Wan Ling directly, asking whether she might visit and teach the same lessons there. Progress, when it came, arrived slowly and unevenly, exactly the way Marshal Griffin had warned it would, but it arrived, thread by careful thread, in no small part because one woman had once decided that the truth, precisely recorded, was worth more than her own safety. Silas watched her ride out on those trips more mornings than he'd ever admit made him nervous, and watched her ride back, always steadier and more certain than the woman who'd left. Meifong herself never fully recovered the health the camp had taken from her, but she outlived every doctor's quiet prediction by the better part of a decade, and spent those years exactly as she'd spent her last months in Vane's camp, tending to whoever needed tending, teaching whoever needed teaching, refusing, every single time, to let anyone convince her that rest was owed to her before the work was finished. She became, in time, something like an aunt to both Wanling and Liang, and something like family to Silas as well, though none of them ever quite settled on the correct word for what she was to all of them. Perhaps, Wanling said once, there simply wasn't a correct word yet, and perhaps that was its own kind of honor to be loved so thoroughly that language hadn't caught up to naming it properly. They married the following autumn, a small, unceremonious gathering under the same cottonwood tree where a canteen had first passed between two strangers odily framed from Larkspur Marshal Griffin down from Cheyenne for the occasion. Liang standing proud beside his sister, Meifong arriving 3 days early just to help with the cooking and refusing, the whole while, to let anyone convince her she was working too hard for a woman only recently recovered from a fever that had nearly killed her. The cottonwood had gone gold with the season, its leaves catching the late afternoon light exactly the way they had the evening. Silas first watched Wanling collapse, gasping into its shade, and if either of them noticed the echo of that terrible first day, folded quietly into the joy of this one, neither said so aloud. Some things, Silas had come to understand, didn't need saying. They only needed living through, twice over, until the second time finally outweighed the first. Wanling War, at Ruth Doss's insistence for Ruth herself, had ridden out from a new post 2 counties over, having left her husband entirely once the truth of Widow's Pass came to light in the trial, and had written Wanling a long, careful letter of apology that the two women had, slowly and deliberately, turned into something like friendship, a simple dress of deep blue calico, the color, Ruth had said, of a Wyoming sky just before full dark. Liang walked her the short distance from the cabin to the tree, his bad leg steadier now than it had been in over a year, and did not once let go of her arm. There was no preacher for 100 miles willing to travel out for so small an occasion, so a circuit judge, passing through Larkspur on unrelated business, agreed to perform the ceremony instead, and remarked afterward, dryly, that in 11 years of officiating he had never once seen a bride recite her vows with quite so much of the same unshakable precision she'd apparently once used to keep 2 sets of railroad ledgers. Marshal Griffin, awkward in a borrowed jacket 2 sizes too broad through the shoulders, offered a toast afterward that surprised everyone present with its plainness. I've spent 11 years watching this territory chew up honest people and spit out very little justice in return, he said, raising a chipped tin cup of Odalese cider. Then 2 exhausted riders showed up at my office with a ledger and more courage than sense, and reminded me why I took this job in the first place. He looked at Silas, then at Wanling, something unguarded moving across his weathered face. Territory's a little more honest for having the 2 of you stubborn enough to stay in it. Don't let anybody, myself included, ever convince either of you that wasn't worth the cost. Here, Odalese said, and the small gathering raised their cups together beneath the gold cottonwood leaves, and for one long, unhurried moment, the whole hard-won weight of everything the last 2 years had cost them settled into something that finally felt, at long last, like simple celebration instead of survival. Old habits, Wanling said, when Silas repeated the judge's comment to her later that evening. Some things, once a person learns to do them exactly right, are simply never worth doing any other way. Even a wedding vow. Especially a wedding vow, she said. I intend to keep this one with considerably more precision than I ever gave Mr. Vane's ledgers. That same evening, once the last of the guests had ridden off toward Larkspur and Cheyenne, and the small settlement outside town, and Liang had finally allowed Meifong to stop fussing over the dishes and sit down with a cup of tea she'd more than earned. Silas and Wanling sat together on the porch he'd built with his own 2 hands, watching the last light of their wedding day fade gold and then violet across land that had cost them both nearly everything to finally call safe. Silas found himself thinking, in the quiet of it, of the boy in the gray coat. The war he had spent 17 years trying to outrun. The particular, stubborn shame that had built Whisper Creek in the first place, brick by brick, as much a fortress against his own memory as a home for anyone else. He had not forgotten the boy, did not expect he ever fully would. But he had learned, finally, after everything this territory had asked of him, that a man could carry an old grief honestly, could let it teach him something true about the value of every life he still had the chance to protect, without letting that grief be the only thing he ever built his life around again. "You're thinking too loud," Wan Ling said, settling against his shoulder with the easy familiarity of a woman who had spent the better part of a year learning every last one of his silences. "I can hear it from here, even on our wedding night." "Just thinking about how far a person can travel," he said, without ever once meaning to leave the place they started. "And where did you end up?" she asked, "after all that traveling." He looked at her at the cottonwood's long shadow stretching across the land they had both, in their own different ways, fought so hard to keep, and felt something settle into place that had been unsettled in him for the better part of 2 decades. "Home," he said simply. "Finally, properly, home." The creek ran on quiet beside them, whispering the same thin, patient song it had sung across 5 lonely years and 1 impossible, transformative summer, and somewhere out past the darkening ridge, the whole vast, indifferent territory carried on exactly as it always had, except now just slightly kinder, in the small, stubborn places where 2 people had once decided, against every reasonable calculation of the odds, that some things were always worth standing and defending, no matter who came riding to cross them.